if you want to play the Queen's Gambit creatively as white, then this is the video for you. This is going to include some special bonus coverage, including this epic attacking system of h4 against the King's Indian. We're also going to see a bunch of other ideas, including how we can favorably transpose to e4 openings. So even if you have experience with e4, you're still going to get a lot out of this video. And with that, let's start with the lines that I will be recommending. So against the move of e6, I'm going to be recommending the exchange variation, but with a little bit of a twist. Rather than playing the move of bishop g5 as nearly everybody does, and which I actually focused on in a repertoire video for black, you can make sure to subscribe to the channel, and then you'll be able to see many more vids like that one. But I'm actually going to be suggesting the move of bishop to f4 instead. It's a more creative approach that players like Alexei Sarana have had really good results with as whites, and it's definitely going to throw your Queen's Gambit client opponents for a curveball. And the nice thing about it, you can also play cd5 and bishop f4 against a lot of the sidelines, so you're going to notice that you're going to be able to get a lot of very similar kind of positions with a lot of transpositions if they play knight f6 later. So it's just going to make your life a lot easier for starting to play the Queen's Gambit without needing to learn a whole lot of the theory. If they do play c6, then I'm going to be suggesting a very creative attack after cd5, cd5, but you'll just have to keep watching the video to see what it is. But we'll see that the exchange is not going to be a boring system with the way that we are going to play it. And if they do play d takes c4, we are going to go for the classical main line, where we take back the pawn, and again got some cool attacking ideas that some strong Turkish GMs like Odomus and Gurul have been playing recently. So again, make sure to stick around for that. And also what I've been using here, because of some technical problems with my chess-based program, I'm actually using the chess.com Explorer, but rather than just giving all of the games which are just going to be like a little bit overwhelming, you can see here I've set it to 2000 to a maximum. So we're not just going to have games where people played bishop f4 because I had no idea what the theory is, but we're going to have players who actually have some idea of how the positions play out. So I hope that they'll make this selection a lot more valuable and a lot more manageable for you as well. And the nice thing about looking at with the Explorer on chess.com is with over 30 billion games, it means that we can really see what's going to be the most common moves that our opponent's going to play. That, for example, going to face d5 more than knight f6, and also, yeah, facing e6 and this more than any of the other systems. And let's say if I just play out the most common moves for both sides. So play c6, e3, bishop d6, and yeah, we just play out the moves just to get the feel for the kind of position that we can get. I'll talk a bit later about possible alternatives and possible improvements, because this is a little bit of a branching point where we can choose between some different move orders. But if we do take the most common move of knight g2 just as an example, we can already see that a lot of our opponents, 38% of them at 2000 plus rating, will play bishop g4. But the thing is, when we put the knight e2, we want to play f3 anyway, right? And go for the Botvinnik plan of pushing for the e4 break. And if they go bishop h5, yeah, white normally does just castle and play it more quietly, after which black does have a reasonable game. But if we do play a move such as e4 instead, which by the way has a 63% score for white at 2000 plus level in the database, you can see that our pawn is actually very safe on d4, because if they take, we can just take back with the bishop and defend it with the queen that way. We're already threatening forks with e5, forking the queen and the knight. And if they try to get out of it, well, we can just play various moves are fine, like e5 is fine. I do think e5 is the one that kind of appeals to me the most. And then if queen b2, there are some really fun attacking ideas where we can castle. And, you know, if they take, like, even though we're down a pawn, we actually get a really strong attack in this position against the black king. Like, there was a game in chess.com where g6 was played, but then if you find the best move for white here, you are actually going to have a winning position. And while you're here, you also might like to like the video if you are enjoying this approach so far of seeing how, by preparing for the most common moves you'll face, rather than the moves that are, you know, the most popular at master play, it's just going to prepare you so much better for your own games, because you're focused on what you'll actually get, not what Stockfish might play. And do also let me know in the comments below, what do you think is the winning move for whites in this case? There, I said it. It's a winning position for white. Can you see why? So when we're playing chess, it's really good to use our imagination. And, well, what if we could get a queen at g7? That would be checkmate, right? How are we going to get there? This is called reverse engineering, by the way, but we're basically can go through here. We can't go queen here because the queen's covering it, but well, maybe we can go a different way. And queen c1 is actually going to be winning for white. If they do try to stop the queen, what happens is we can just move the rook, just like this. And eventually we're going to put them in a spot where they won't be able to cover this square anymore. So for example, after queen here, we even have a little trick of bishop to g4, where if they do take the bishop, we then just have checkmate by force, as you can see here. So that's definitely a way in which you could just win the game even quite directly, just following the most common moves for black, and our little improvement of pawn to e4 that I mentioned just at this point, as a way to punish this very common, but in some ways natural mistake of trying to get the bishop out. Because think about it, if you play a move like knight d7, you are kind of blocking in your bishop, and it'll take a bit of time to get that bishop to a good diagonal. So you can sort of understand why you don't really see this as much in the chess.com database, even though it is probably one of the better approaches for black. They also play the move rook e8 a fair bit. And again, you have a little bit of a choice of how you want to play it, where most people do just castle at this point. But then in that case, while I think a position like knight d7 does, I think, give white a small edge, you can play moves such as, for example, queen to d2, which sort of has this idea that you can then play a move like f3, and again, just go for the e4 push, because we're just making sure that e3 pawn is defended first, right? And if you do also want to really be successful at these openings, one tip I would give would be to just start playing them as soon as possible. Because what a lot of people do is they think, oh, I'm going to wait until I know every single little detail, and then I'll start playing the opening. And then you wonder why you're not really remembering much, right? So just play it first, get a feel for it, and it'll be so much faster for you. Because also, if they play knight g6, I can already see that this is just the dream position in this Botvinnik setup. That again, we're threatening to go e5, and then the knight can come in, and a position like this, we're just going to have such a massive initiative with, either knight d5 or knight e4, both being very good for white. And also, if they do play a move like bishop g4, that will admittedly be probably a better move for black. So if you do want to avoid that, you can also just play a move such as, for example, queen d2 first. So that now bishop g4 is just going to be hitting a little bit of a brick wall in a sense, and you can still go for that plan of preparing f3 and e4. Again, that's the Botvinnik Kasparov plan is the name of it. So you might want to write Botvinnik Kasparov in the comments below to make sure you remember it. There are other ways you can play as well. As I mentioned here, you could also, if you want something that's a little bit less dynamic and a little bit more positional, you could also play h3 and then the move knight f3 and just go for your standard minority attack. Small salties, it's probably a little more precise to go queen c2 first, just to not let the knight get to e4 and to give him this really good counterplay on the king side. Because e4 is kind of the strong point for black in this structure, so just flicking in queen c2 and making black work a lot hard to get knight e4 is just going to be very nice for us. And then the middle game plan is just to go for the minority attack with b4, b5, and that will just give you a very, very pleasant advantage. If they go a5, you can just play a3 and just continue with b4, b5 anyway. You can also play moves like rook fc1 and knight a4, where you just make it that they do have some weaknesses they've created with a5 that we can latch onto here. So you can even play a little bit with the pieces as well before you go for the standard minority attack and trying to isolate their pawn structure. Normally in these videos, I would go a little bit deeper into some of the details, but because of the fact that I tend to save more of the deep dive videos for when I have like my chess base database sort of working, because then I can show like a lot of master level games and show the model games. But this is just going to be more aimed at getting you started. It sort of makes sense that with knight f3 and bishop g4 being a rather annoying pin, that explains why I go h3 and only then this afterwards. Okay, so with that, what if they don't play bishop d6? What if they play something like bishop to f5, for example? Well, after bishop f5, there's actually a few different moves you can go for. I think I remember I even covered a game on the channel previously where Serrano beat Carlsen. I think it's called How to Beat Magnus Carlsen's the name of the video if you want to look it up. But basically, in that game, Serrano played this f3 move, which actually has a 57% win rate at 2000 plus level on chess.com. And the idea is pretty simple. You just want to play the move g4. You can also play knight e2 if you really want to avoid double pawns, but I do think the double pawns actually kind of help us here because they can't then play bishop g6 without the bishop getting trapped like this, as you can see. So more often they're going to play a move like bishop g6, but then we can just go for a kind of Jabava London style pawn storm, where I think in a position like this, white is just going to be a little bit better, where we can very easily sit the king on a square like f2, and with that extra space, it makes it very hard for black to find a good pawn break, because they're just going to be weakening their position if they do something like that. So a lot of arrows, but I think you get the picture that a position like this is just going to be a little bit better for white. You can play directly with e4. You can play it more patiently. It really is. A nice thing about this short kind showing you with bishop f4 is that there are a lot of good ways to play it. That if you forget one move, like say if you forget the move f3, well, there are other fine moves like a move like h3, and doing it this way is also fine. And I mean, yeah, if you like play a harmless move like bishop d3, it's not like you're going to be worse because you played not the more critical approach. But I do think the pawn storm idea is a very fun one. I think you're just going to really like quite a lot. And if they do try to stop it with a move like h5, then yeah, that just allows you to just go back to the Botvinnik Kasparov plan where h5 sticks out like a bit of a sore thumb. If you are looking for a system for black, I will suggest the move knight h5 as being leading to some very interesting complications. Like, you're not going to face it that often, but is probably the approach I would suggest black explores if you are looking for something against our repertoire. Though I do think white does have very good compensation for the exchange even here. So with that, though, that is getting a little bit into the weeds of things. Let's move to what if they play a move such as bishop e7 instead? Well, this is actually going to transpose to a line called the Alatortsev. So that is, you could also get this position from a move order like bishop e7. And okay, it's true, the mix of c6 and knight f6 is not really the ideal one for black. Like usually they should play one move, but not the other one in a sense. But if they do play this, you can see how it transposes back to the position that arose from our blue-bound move order, or Serrano move order rather. So if they go bishop e7, I would just play it like a normal exchange QGD. But what you're going to see here is that it's just going to be a much better version for white. There's different ways you can play it. Like h3, I think is probably slightly the most accurate move order, just so that if they go knight h5, you just have that hidey hole for the bishop on h2, right? But after rook e8, you're basically just a full tempo up on a normal position. Because normally you have this position with the bishop on g5, but in a lot of positions you end up playing bishop f4 voluntarily anyway, just to not allow black to exchange the dark squared bishops and get counterplay that way. And so at the end of the day, a position like this is just going to be very, very pleasant for white. Like you can just swap the bishops, go for the minority attack. The move rook fb1 or rook ab1, it's not going to make the biggest difference. But rook fb1 is the move that scores a little bit better if you want to use that as a tiebreaker. But yeah, it's pretty clear that white is just going to have a very easy position to play. Obviously, you don't want to play b4 right away because then they would have some captures to win a pawn. But you can prepare it with moves like knight a4 and again exploit some of those weaknesses and then play b4 at the right time on the next move, for example. So you can see you're just playing very familiar ideas. Like you're just going for the minority attack, and a very standard approach has been played, for example, by Karpov very successfully in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, but doing it in a way where we just have a lot less theory to learn than if the bishop was on g5. So that works pretty well for us. And with that, it really kind of shows the picture on this Slav-style c6 move pretty well. And a lot of their other moves are going to transpose, but there are also a few differences I want to also touch on. So if we take the move of bishop to d6 here, personally, I like just playing bishop takes d6 and kind of playing it again in the sort of, Serrano style, just bishop to d3. It is true they can also play bishop f5. Like, it's not a very common move, but it is probably one of the better options for black. And if you want to set some problems against it, I'd probably suggest something like knight f3 and knight h4 as being a good direction to potentially look into. You can also play queen b3. It's another move that scores well in the database, but yeah, this is probably the direction that I would look to as a way to try to set black some practical problems. We can try to get the knight into f5 a bit later with with something like this, like bishop d3 or queen c2 to support. I mean that's kind of the worst case scenario for us, really. That we get a position like this where yeah, even here white's still scoring quite well in practice, so it's not something that bother me too much. Like if they do play g6, it kind of just opens the door for a Pillsbury style attack with f4, f5. So you've got points like that kind of working in your favor. But what you are going to face more often is the move of castles, and with this we can kind of understand now why we beat black to the diagonal in this case. We've already looked at what happens after c6. That's actually the move you'll face the most often. The move bishop g4 is the next most common, and there are various ways you can play like knight e2 or queen c2 or queen b3. It's going to be a similar kind of position regardless. The move of queen c2 is the one that does score the best for white though, because it just has that flexibility to it. And if they do play something like bishop h5, trying to trade off the bishop, again, there's various reasonable options, but something like knight e2 and just trading and castling long is going to be quite healthy. You've got some plans where you can go h4 and try to open up the king side in your favor. So yeah, objectively, black's probably fine, but you can argue it's a little bit easier to play white in a position like this. And I think that's something important to realize when we are playing creative d4. Like, we're not really trying to force an advantage out of the opening, because that's not really feasible regardless of what you play as white. You're not going to force an advantage because black is basically just fine. We just want to get some positions where we're more comfortable, we're more familiar with the moves than they are, and they're going to already have to start thinking probably almost as soon as we play bishop f4, but certainly by this point most likely. And if they play c5, yeah, it just gives you quite a nice position against the IQP. Like if you've got something like, well, if they play queen c5, it's actually a little bit of a mistake because the threat of knight c7 kind of forces them to sort of trade the queens and to have a really nice blockade of the of the IQP square. Like knight e2, this sort of thing is very very comfortable for white. There's also evidence by white despite its good score in the database. And so with that, yeah, you're not really that concerned about c5. Like if black wants to play a move such as c5, they probably should be doing it in a position like this one, which is the way the engine kind of wants to try to equalize. But it's also something where, white, I think, still has a fine enough game. Like you go e3. And also if they take, there are ways you can play where you can either play like e takes d4 and just have a very safe symmetrical position where, white is like never really going to lose, but you can still try to press for a win without any real sort of risk. Because like they did try to pin our knight, we do have f3, so that's why I put now on e2 and not on f3. And if they do take, it also just helps us put pressure on d5. So we've got little ideas like that to try to play for a win from this objectively equal position. And also other options like playing queen d4 and playing with the queen in the center. Which actually, if they play bishop d7, you do get some nice pressure against the pawn. So some tricks like that that can give you a little bit of an advantage if black doesn't play it precisely. And also if they, in this position, you also have the option of playing knight f3 too. So that's another way you can also approach it. Where now like playing cd4 is not going to be as effective when you can take back with the knights. I will say though, the move of c4 is one that is played a lot though from black. So, people are probably going to know what they're doing in this case and think e3 is just the bit more flexible move that I would recommend. And yeah, I mean, if they play bishop e7, which is going to be quite similar to what we looked at before, because they're probably going to play c6 anyway. If they do play c5, you again just get this nice position against the IQP. Like something like this is just going to be slightly better for white when our bishop is more active on f4 than it would be on c1, which is where it usually is in these kind of positions. And if they play d4, I mean, we're not too concerned about it. We can just take and make the point that with moves like knight a4, we can still fight for an advantage even in a very symmetrical position like this. It's just a bit hard for black to fully complete their queenside development. And so with that, I think that shows the picture pretty well with bishop f4. And one final move I will mention, like a lot of these moves also come up in different versions later, like this bishop b4. for example, is something you could very easily get via move order of, take, and then black usually ends up playing knight f6 anyway, so it's kind of another way you could get to this position. But I do think that the Rogozin is probably a little bit less effective when we aren't committed to the move of knight f3, because one of black's main ideas in these positions is to try to get a knight to e4 and attack. But that just isn't going to be as effective a pin when we keep the option of knight g2. So, for example, in a position like this, you can kind of see that the usual Rogozin style moves of c5 are just falling a little bit flat after knight e2, and it's kind of like what we looked at before. Like you could even, just take and transpose literally to line we're just looking at with bishop e7. And I think that's really the power of playing in a thematic way where you're playing a similar way against a lot of black's options, is it allows you to very easily navigate the move orders. And if they play something a little bit weird or unusual that you haven't seen before, you can usually bring it back to somewhat familiar territory for yourself. I will mention just very quickly, there is also the semi-Tarrasch with knight d5, but I do think that in this case, the move of rook b1 is a move I had a little bit of a soft spot for, which is just aimed at stopping them from, recycling the bishop and being able to go for this rock solid, defensive setup from there. So obviously when we play rook b1, yeah, if they take now, they don't have the bishop b4 check anymore, so white will be a little bit better in a position like this one, for instance. And if they play bishop e7, you do have some interesting choices where, for example, a move of h4 and h5 is one that Carlsen played against Dominguez, getting some just very interesting attacking chances. So that's something you can play to get some interesting attacking positions while still, avoiding a lot of theory. But this sort of attack is obviously very difficult for black to defend in a practical game, as evidenced by White's very good score in the database. And so with that, I think we can kind of move on to some of the more sideline approaches that black can play. And like I said before, with a lot of black's alternatives, we can just play cd5 and bishop f4. Like, for example, here, the most common alternative for black, which you'll see about 15% of the time, is the triangle, which obviously is true, could also arise from a Slav move order in theory. But in this case, yeah, the move c takes d5. This is not the best scoring option for white, but it does still score pretty decently, just going bishop f4. And you'll kind of see it after bishop d6 that if they do play knight f6, it's just going to transpose to what we're just looking at beforehand anyway. They do have some alternatives, like they can play bishop f5 and they can play knight e7. So, there are some slightly interesting independent setups that black can go for. But if bishop f5, I do think that g4 is a kind of interesting move. We can sort of play it very much like the Botvinnik approach in the Alatortsev, where you're just kind of going for the pawn storm. If h5, g5, we just have that extra space to work with. And our knight's just going to come to f4, and we're just going to annoy their bishop. I mean, yeah, to be fair, black is certainly going to be very much fine in this position as well. But we did succeed in getting an original position with decent scope to outplay the opponent due to some very clear imbalances in the structure, like so. And white does score pretty reasonably in the database, like they're scoring a fairly decent plus score here. So with that, if they do play knight to e7 instead, then I would probably just play. Again, you can kind of play a few different options. The one that's kind of interesting that the engine mentions is actually going queen to b3, which at first sight looks like it doesn't make much sense, but it's just allowing you to play the bishop out without allowing bishop f5 because of this attack on the pawn. And so you can kind of get to this familiar territory where you are going to have a slightly worse version of some of the positions I showed before. Like that's a little bit the price we pay for, trying to play the same thing as absolutely everything. But at the same time, I think our plans are still quite clear. Like we're still going for the minority attack, and you can, just follow like very, very sort of standard approaches here. So yeah, queen b3 is kind of an interesting way to play, just to get a bit of a, to just not let them get in bishop f5 so readily. So that would be my suggestion there. And also, yeah, for other moves, like again, if they play knight f6, it's transposed to what we were just looking at, and that really does kind of show the picture. Like cd5 obviously is a bit of a poor man's version of an exchange Slav. When the bishop is just stuck in like this, it's really not going to be a very nice position, whereas our moves are just very natural and logical here. So with that, if they do play a move like c5, the Tarrasch, I would just probably take, and yeah, just like knight f3, like you can even just play very natural moves such as, just the main line with g3 is there's obviously nothing really wrong with just doing something very, very simple like this kind of setup. That being said, if you do want something a bit more creative, I will mention the move of, in this position, of DC5 is a very interesting Serrana idea. And the idea is that after D4, you just go knight A4 and you defend the pawn that way. And this approach actually scores very well for white because if black doesn't know the move of bishop D7, which has only been played in 16% of games at 2000 plus level, then white just gets a very nice advantage. For example, like this is what I have to find in order to equalize as black from this point. Like knight f3, a5, this sort of thing is how black can hold the position. But if they don't find this, then and these moves also like very counterintuitive in my opinion. Then white just gets a very nice advantage. Like after bishop c5, for example, you just can take let them take back the piece, but then you just go e3 and you just have a very nice bishop pair advantage, pressure against their center. And overall, yeah, if you know b4, you even get a bigger advantage. But even if you just play normally, that's also going to be obviously pretty nice for white as well with the bishops. And also, if they do play some other gambit move like knight c6, you can just play e3 and just kind of put the pressure on their center, consolidate, and again, you're just kind of going to be a pawn up at a certain point. So as you can see, yeah, that's a nice little move. Like this one, I also picked up from Serrana's games. We had some very good results of this on chess.com especially. And yeah, I mean, if bishop e7, there's something you're only really going to face, I think, at a very high level of play. But I will mention g4 and knight g2 as two options you might like to explore in your own time. You can also play in Serrana style of f3, kind of like we saw in the related variation with knight to f6, as it were. So that's also an option, of course, if you want something a bit less theoretical. But in any case, let's now look at what happens if black doesn't play the move of e6, but plays it in a bit of a different fashion. Like, what if they play the Slav, which is something you're going to face nearly as often the uh, as the move e6. And the Slav is also something I did recommend quite recently in some pretty detailed videos on the channel. If you want to make sure you don't miss out on these sort of videos in the future, then for those of you who are already subscribed, I would suggest to click on the notifications bell and set notifications to all, and I'll show you won't miss out on some of those deep dives like that. So at this point, actually, there are a couple of different ways you could play the move order because I sort of made knight c3 the move order in this case, and then playing cd5. And the reason for that was just to sort of take away some options like black playing knight c6 here, for instance. That being said, yeah, it's kind of up to you whether you would rather allow this or whether you would rather allow something like d takes c4, for example. Because obviously e6 here is going to transpose back into the, exchange coverage that we had just a moment ago. But let's focus on the position after knight f6, cd5, and c takes d5. Because at this point, the way that most strong players play is the move of bishop f4, followed by e3. Sometimes they'll go knight f3, then bishop f4 as well. And that's why I really focused on in my video on the Slav defense for black, on how to meet d4 deep dive if you want to look it up. But the move of f3 is one that actually gives a 56% score for white. And I think the name is called the boar attack after, which is kind of funny, the attack of the boars like coming at you. But it's also because there was this FIDE master from the US, Carl Bohr, who wrote a chess book course on this f3. And I mean, I feel like the score kind of speaks for itself. Like the idea is that most of your opponents are going to go knight to c6, and most of them are going to take the pawn from there, which is one of the things that black should do. But then we go d5, and you can sort of see that it's a completely opposite position of what black was hoping for. Instead of having a quiet position with like the pawns on d4, d5 and maneuvering, we managed with some creative play to force them into a much more dynamic position here with knight f3. And I'm just playing out the most common moves for black just so you can see it. But like most people here play the move e takes d5, and this is where we have a little bit of a trick up our sleeves here, in fact. Because they're probably assuming that we're just going to take the pawn automatically, and then they'll just play their bishop out, and our king's going to feel the draft a bit. But what we can do is we can actually play the move e5. And I think I remember actually beating a Grandmaster Mikalik in this in Chess 24 a long time ago. But basically the idea is you go bishop b5, and rather than try and get the pawn back, you just go for the attack. And it's a nice little subtlety that you play castles, because you play rook f1, because if you castle, you do give black the time to castle their king to safety. So by playing rook f1, you're just avoiding that bishop c5 check, and so it's something that definitely can surprise the opponent. In fact, in only 36% of the games did black play the move of f6, but it turns out that everything else is just losing. Like if queen e7, you can just take because of, queen e5 and this being a checkmate. Like this is something that happened actually in quite a lot of games in the database at the 2000 plus levels. So like if they can fall for it, your opponents definitely can as well. Or if f5, we can actually just even take the pawn because they can't take our queen because of the pin from the bishop. So that's why we played bishop b5 before. So black really needs to play the move of f6 here is essentially the crux of it. And after takes and knight takes f6. And especially like I would say the way white should play is to play queen to e2. Like that's going to be the approach that will give you the pressure. Like if queen e7, bishop to e3 or bishop d7 first. Like there's a few ways to play it, but this is going to be a position where you're just going to go castle long and just have very good compensation for the pawn just based on their king being a lot weaker than ours. By the way, it's very unlikely your opponents will find queen b4, but if they don't, they just end up in a much, much worse position, as you can check from the database in your own time, if you were so inclined. But we just basically castle long against pretty much everything. And also a trap that actually comes up a lot, like black most often doesn't play the only move of queen e7, but actually normally play bishop to e7. And this is where we can play a really cool trick. This one actually has a 96% score, like 96% win rate for white in the Chess.com database of 2000 plus. So these plays are no slouches, right? But the point is that we can play rook f6, sacrifice the rook. They obviously can't take with the bishop because of the pin, and if they take with the pawn, we actually just have a very clear forced mate with bishop h6. And like at this point, there's like 317 games where black got checkmated like this. So again, it's a very powerful trap, and we can see that black playing the most common moves is not really working out very well for them here. For this position, it's probably better for black to play a move like a6 and try to avoid that, but it's also something that virtually none of your opponents will play. Like it's in 2% of games, 2000 plus. So, if your opponent finds it, it's obviously very impressive, but your position is still fine anyway. And yeah, I mean, in going back to this position, like they really do need to play e6 at some point. Like if they go bishop g4, for example, just queen a4 is just going to give you way too strong of an attack. Like your central initiative is just going to be way too much when they can't keep the knight on e5. And I think that shows the picture pretty well. Like, again, a lot of black's other moves are just not really going to be as effective, generally speaking. So we're putting him in a bit of a tough spot here. And if they do play a move like e6, we just kind of get this very nice French defense where we just go f4. We have very natural moves for our development. Whereas knight is really getting in the way of their piece placement, like bishop e7, knight f3. We're just going to get a position like this, where when they castle, you can even think about moves like h4 actually at different moments, like h4, and just really going for this kind of attacking ideas, which can either play directly or prepare with just using your extra space to say that you have a very clear long term advantage. So you can see how unpleasant this can get from Black's perspective. Just even playing one natural but sort of mistaken move. Because if they're surprised, like they're going to try and usually bring it back to something familiar, but it's just very hard for Black to do that here. Like once again, if they do play e6, you can just play e4, and if they do play d4, you just have that very strong center. So something like this is just going to just be very pleasant for white. Like you can play e5, you can play queen d3. There's a few different options that white can go for, but I think queen d3 is just the most solid, where you just prepare to castle and just are better with your space advantage, like so. I do want to mention, and I did say this also in my video on how to like meet d4. I did cover it from Black's perspective there real briefly. If they play bishop f5, I think g4 does give you some quite interesting attacking chances, and you can kind of play it like a good Jababa London in that case, where like for example g5 and just get this really strong initiative on the king side, and you can also take their pawn as well, which never hurt anyone. But I do want to mention, for the sake of intellectual honesty, that the move of queen b6 is actually a very good move for black, as I pointed out in my video from black's point of view. And the idea of it is basically to meet e4 with takes and e5, and it just turns out black just gets a really good position where they get the lead in development. And if you play queen e2, they can also just go like bishop to. They have a few approach. They can go bishop e6, bishop e4, but essentially they are going to get this pawn back and just have sort of the better side of equality with this outpost knight. And so my suggestion would be if they play queen b6, I just say, okay, well done, you found the best move. I'm just gonna play e3, like accept that the position is just equal, and you play chess. You get a creative position as you're hoping for, and the better player is going to win at the end of the day. So, but like I said, like queen b6, a move that only has been played in 3% of games at the 2000 plus rating, and obviously it's going to be a lot lower at lower levels than that. So yeah, it's a pretty good gamble where you get pretty good attacking chances as white if they don't find queen b6. And so yeah, with that, I wish you luck with playing this f3 in your own games. And it sort of makes sense that if you do use this move order and play it this way, the move e4 kind of gives you an improved version of the boar attack because you didn't need to play the move of f3. Like it's pretty obvious the inclusion of these moves favors white because d4, d5, you just get a really good initiative in the center. Like for example, 95, and this is already going to be substantially better for white because we just have a massive lead in development, and the control over e6 makes it very hard for black to develop their king side and us to get their king out of the open center. So that's a trap that a lot of players have fallen into as black. Like this is the most common move here by some margin, where they think they're winning a pawn and they miss or at least underestimate the d5 intermezzo. If they play knight f6, yeah, don't play f3. Like just go e5 and just get that really good kind of French type position that we were seeing before. And if 94, yeah, there's various moves you can explore, like bishop to d3 is the one that kind of scores the best to white, but there are also some other options like bishop b5 and knight e2 and even a few others that you can also potentially explore as white. They're a bit more creative, so I kind of let you kind of choose the one that just feels right for you because you can't really go too far wrong as black there, as white there. And yeah, obviously if they play knight d7, yeah, you can even take the pawn if you really want to, but you can also just play it more quietly and just not let them get the kind of bishop g4 they're sort of hoping for because we're just a little bit faster with our attack in this case. So yeah, I think with that, that just gives a pretty good picture. If they do play e6 again, you can either, if you have some experience with the advanced French, this is a slightly improved version of an advanced French for white. Like bishop b5 does give white a small edge in my opinion, just negating the pressure against the d pawn. And if you want a more open position, yeah, you can also take and make the point that white has a very small edge in a position like this, with some kind of similar ideas to what we saw in one of the Serrano exchange QGD lines as such. And so with that, I think that covers the Slav picture pretty well. Like if you do want to avoid, I don't really see a reason to avoid knight c6 because e4 just think is quite good for white. But with that, I think we can move then to the Queen's Gambit accepted. So it's kind of the last of the really big systems within d4, d5, c4. The rest are definitely like much more sidelines in a sense. Now, the way that I used to play it as white was I used to mainly play the move e4, this quite ambitious move. But I think the move of knight f3 and just playing the main line is definitely a very decent approach also. If you do want to avoid some sidelines, like if you want to avoid moves such as bishop to g4 or avoid some sidelines like b5, then you can also just start with the e3 move order, and that just cuts out a lot of those sidelines that black can play, and it'll often just transpose back. The trade-off is that you do let black play the move of e5, so as you can see, when you play d4, c4, there are a few move order points like this that can come up. But I do think in this position here, you do get some pretty decent chance of an advantage with playing knight f3 and queen e2. So that's a direction that you might like to explore these kind of endgames in your own time if you want to go a bit deeper. Because I do think white is going to be just a little bit better in these kinds of positions, just based on the very sort of easy piece play and initiative that white has with their lead in development. So with that, yeah, you're going to really see the move of like knight f6 and e6 more than anything else, really. And after bishop c4, it was kind of interesting to see, like from my own chess.com games, that below 2000, most people are just playing moves like bishop e7 or bishop e4, and basically playing very passively. But in that case, you just go castles, knight c3, e4, and just get a very easy advantage out of the opening. So here I am going to focus more on the move of c5, which is what you'll see most often. And then after a6, there was a really cool little shortcut I wanted to share with you. Because the most common moves in the database are going to be moves like a4 to stop b5, or moves like dc5, where you just play this, play this endgame where like whites obviously can, press for two results. Like there are different plans where you can, try to bring the knights around to create some pressure. But of course, objectively, black shouldn't have too many problems if they know what they're doing. Though it is a little bit hard for them to play for a win in these positions as black. So if you do want to just like play for two results, it's not a bad option. But I think the more dynamic approach and the more fun one that's more like a surprise opponent as well is going to be rook to e1. And the idea of rook e1 is that you're kind of preparing to move e4, e5, but you're not necessarily committing to it either. Like if they go b5, you can now play the bishop back to f1, and your bishop kind of gets out of the way of your other pieces. And meanwhile, you have moves such as a4, where you can really start to hit this weakness of the b5 pawn and just use the c4 outpost to have, in my view, a very pleasant advantage. Also, if they do play 97, there's even moves like e4, where you can even just kind of give up the pawn temporarily and just have a really strong initiative here, like bishop g5 and the queen coming into the attack. And it's actually just going to be a very difficult position for black. Like black's already, in fact, probably just close to lost in a position like this with the queen just swinging into the attack on black's king. It really is very much like a turbocharged Alep and Sicilian for white at this point. And these were just showing the most common moves for black on each turn, so it really gives you a taste of how natural moves and black playing their natural setup of the Moran is just going to put them in very hot water. Instead, something like knight c6 is definitely much more circumspect, but then we can play a move like knight to c3, and if they take, we kind of just get a pretty decent IQP position. So we'll normally play a move like b5 to try to avoid something like bishop e7, and whites will be able to try to argue they have a slightly improved version of some of the bishop e2 and these sort of lines I showed before. Because of the move knight c6, like they probably would prefer the knight on d7. So some little subtleties like that you can use to try to outplay the opponent. Also, there's move bishop d2, like that's another way you can also try to put a little bit of pressure on black's queen side. It's not like black is fully equalized yet in this position. So for that reason, that's kind of why the move of b5 is definitely more principled. And here we are not going to put the bishop on f1 because we played knight c3. So that plan of going a4 is just a lot less effective when our knight would have to lose 2 tempi going back. And so instead we're going to play bishop to d3 in this case, realizing that they're not threatening to take the pawn on d4, obviously, because of the bishop b5. I mean, you probably knew that already, but just making sure that we're all on the same page. And so more often black will play a move like bishop to b7 instead. But then I think it was... I'm trying to remember if it was exactly this position or a different one that happened in the game between Sindarov against Caruana. I mean, there's a pretty easy way for me to check, actually. Like, I can just change the filters to master games, and it will probably bring up the players as such. Okay, because the chess.com database is old, yeah, it's not really showing that. But okay, that's a trick that you can use, if you are using the Explorer yourself. But I remember I think Caruana ended up playing something like knight a5 and got this gf6 structure that just ended up being, I think, quite good for Sindarov. In your own games, you're probably going to be more likely to face cd4, but I do think that in this case, after, say, takes and ef d4, I just think white is just going to be quite a lot better because black has a really hard time finding a safe refuge for the king with this litany of pawns they've moved forward. And with approach like bishop e4 and d5, I just think white is just much, much better. So this is a way in which you can really punish a Queen's Gambit accepted player. And it's always a good sign you found a really good practical weapon when black's most common moves, like I've been showing here, are putting black in some hot water. So yeah, that's a nice little idea, like this a4 and knight e4 to give you a little bit of an advantage. From black's point of view, yeah, maybe c4 might be a better attempt to maintain the balance. But here as well, the engine is kind of bullish about white's chances, so you can explore position like this in your own time if you want to go deeper. But just so that the video doesn't end up being like 10 hours long, I will move on to some slightly different positions. Like if they go knight c6 here, in that case I would probably just play knight c3, a6, and rook to e1. Kind of is a logical fit. It is transposed to what we were literally looking at just before. And so that would be the direction I would sort of recommend, where it turns out rook e1 is a nice move order because it kind of takes away a lot of the independent value of some of black's alternatives. And if they do take and play this sort of IQP position, it's definitely going to be a better version for white. And I think that queen e2 is it's a rare but a really interesting idea that just scores really, really well in the database, like 52% win rate for white. And the point is that if you get the rook on d1, it's just very hard for black to get in the move d5. Because normally the version black gets to this in a normal QGA is with the pawn on a4, where they can kind of put the knight on b4, stabilize, and keep white's edge to an absolute minimum. But obviously in this case, yeah, knight b4 isn't really working so well when you can just play a3 and kick it away. Like the fact you haven't given black the outpost is just such a huge difference. And with moves like rook d3 and just swing the rook over to g3 or h3, you're going to have an incredibly strong attack against the black king. And in fact, black is probably already just strategically lost in a position like this, as evidenced by white having a 75% win rate in the database of 2000 plus level. So those are the kind of attacking ideas can really serve you well. But if they don't let you play d5, just go knight e5, swing the rook in the attack, and black is really going to be hurting there. And that also, yeah, this explains why I'm just not that concerned about moves like cd4 in general. Like just like I said, get a really good version of a normal IQP position if they play that really fast. And if they do play something like a6 and b5, like trying to, move order us out of this bishop f1 idea. I mean, you can still play bishop d3 and, play a4. And I mean, white's edge is going to be pretty small, but you definitely can still, like, put the knight on c4. And, your plan's going to be pretty straightforward. Like, at least you're going to get a middle game with a small edge. And, then it's just up to you how you use it from there. So, I mean, the engine does point out some more promising approaches, but I don't think you're going to face this a6 b5 often enough for it to be to be necessary to go too deep into it, unless you're like already a master player, and then you might start to go deeper into some of these alternatives. But for everyone else, I think it's going to be plenty what we covered just here. As far as black alternatives go, the one that you'll really see the most often is knight f6. Like even on the 2000 plus on chess.com is a move that you will see 9% of the time, this martial defense. The problem for black is that cd5 is just a really good move. Obviously, this is just a very bad version of a Scandinavian when we have two pawns in the center. So I'll usually go knight d5, and a small wrinkle I'll suggest here, and it's not the first time I've mentioned in videos, but the move knight f3 is a little bit more precise than playing e4, because e4 does give them some options like playing e5 and trying to hit back in the center for some kind of interesting play. And so by playing knight f3 and then e4, we just avoid those e5 breaks. For example, g6 is, just going to be a very comfortable Grunfeld, because they weren't able to weaken our structure with knight c3 and c5. So now c5 is just not really going to make a whole lot of sense when we can, just take the pawn like that. And knight c6 again just doesn't really have that same desired effect when, when they don't have bishop g4 to pressure the pawn. And you'll have d5 to kick around their knight as well. So at the end day, white is just going to be a lot better in a position like this one with pretty natural moves, as it were. So with that, if we do go back to this position, like obviously e6 as well, like this is pretty clearly going to be a very advantageous position for white also, with some pretty standard attacking ideas to follow. The one move that can be a little bit tricky is the move of bishop f5, which you're really going to face it like 8% of the time, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. But I do think knight d2 is a really good reply, where you can just go e4, and if they do stop e4, you can kind of switch to a bit of a Catalan, but it's a Catalan where black's piece placement just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, so it's a pretty simple and pretty effective counter for white. So with that, we can move to some of the sidelines. I don't want to spend too much time on things like the Alban, Chigorin, or Baltic, because you're not really going to face them much, but you can definitely follow a very common sense approach like knight bd2 and knight b3 and just going after the pawn is a pretty easy approach to understand. And there's also some cool ideas, like for example, the move of g3 is one that the Indians like quite a lot. As white, just saying that the knight can't go here anymore. And also e4 is another approach I've recommended to a lot of students as well about a decade ago, where you end up having a pretty big advantage with the because it's a Berlin endgame where you're up a pawn. That's kind of the way I like to look at it. So with that, we can move to I think the next sideline, like knight c6. I mean, there's various ways white can get an edge. You can really kind of pick and choose, but I think the one that probably fits the best with our repertoire is just going to be. Actually, they usually play bishop g4 to be fair, so let's make that the move. But I think the one that fits the best for our repertoire is just going to be just to take and play bishop f4. And yeah, it's true you're not going to get the biggest advantage possible, but you basically just have an exchange QGD where they misplace a knight on c6. So I think you can't really complain too much about about that and the edge that the white's going to get with pretty natural moves from here as such. So if they do play bishop f5, I mean you can just play cd5 and queen a4 check and or you can play rook b1 is technically even better. You can just let them take on a2 if they want because you just end up having such a massive attack for the material here. So something like that, yeah, I wouldn't really worry about too much. Like you can check it in your own time. This gambit if you want to, but it's nothing too complicated in my opinion. The Austrian is an opening that actually is kind of better than its reputation, and honestly, I'm probably going to be covering it in a video on this YouTube channel in the future. So again, if you set your notifications and tap them to all, that'll ensure you don't miss it out when it comes up. But if you want a very lazy practical system, you can just play e3. This is a move that actually is the best scoring move and has a 53% win rate for white at the 2000 plus level. And the idea is you're just going to go knight c3 and kick away their queen. And if they take, you basically transpose into a line of the Alep Sicilian that is fairly well known to be a little bit better for white, like both of knight c3 and bishop e2 are both going to give white a small edge. But knight c3 is the one that scores a little bit better if you do want to explore that direction. So with that, we will move to what if they don't play the move of d5. So that's getting into more things like the Indian defenses, more of this hyper-modern kind of stuff. And I do have some ideas here as well. Like I might not go into quite the same depth as I did the d5 moves. Although it's interesting actually looking at the chess.com database, like it's kind of when you take the games to a 2000 plus rating, like that's when you start to face knight 6 more than d5. But if you are rated below 2000, you are going to face d5 most likely quite a bit more often. So that 2000 is just kind of the threshold for that in a way. So we're going to play c4, play Queen's Gambit style once again. And actually after e6, what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer kind of two different ways of playing it. One that's a little bit, still kind of a serious line that, a lot is played quite a bit. And one that is sort of very rare, but actually fits really, really well with the rest of our repertoire. So let me show you what I mean. My main suggestion is going to be to play knight c3 and allow the Nimzo Indian, because if they play d5, obviously we're transposing back to what we were looking at the start of this video with this Serrana bishop f4 exchange QGD. But you are probably wondering what exactly I'm going to recommend against the Nimzo, because obviously a lot of different systems that that white can play, right? These being the three main ones. If you're wondering what white's best scoring move is here, white actually scores the best at the 2000 plus rating band on chess.com with the move of f3, which is actually very similar in spirit to the line I'll be recommending. The reason I've decided not to recommend it here is because I'm probably going to be covering it deeply in a future YouTube video, and just want to kind of leave it more for that. And also, I do think that if you are like a master watching this, that I think a lot of like pretty much every grandmaster just kind of knows the way to equalize, and it's very hard to kind of avoid those very forcing equalizing systems in my opinion. And so I think a way to keep a bit more tension in the position, and it's a move that by the way also scores nearly as well as f3, like the difference is pretty small. But being able to play still in a similar spirit to f3 without as much fury to it is the same-ish variation with a3. And it's true, these pawns are quite weak, and there will be many lines where we will be even sacrificing that c4 pawn. On the other hand, we do also have some very clear plans of being able to push for the e4 break and get a really strong pawn roller on the king side for a very good attack against their king. Sometimes you'll see f3 and then e4 as another way of playing it. So after the move of c5, that's the move that you're going to see the most often, but I will also touch on moves like castles and b6 very quickly as well in this training. A move like d5, you're just generally very happy to see. Like it'll just allow you to get some very easy attacking positions where you can just play the Kasparov, the Botvinnik Kasparov plan. I mean, you could even play bishop f4 as well. Like it's a very rare move, but one that the engine does like that will allow you to again kind of play an improved version of the Serrano setup because of black giving up their bishop pair unnecessarily. So obviously black doesn't want to trade off the double pawns because that's really the one problem of sorts with white's position. After c5, there's actually a choice of two options you can kind of go for here. And I was originally going to cover both of them in this video, like to cover both e3 and the more trendy approach these days of f3 as white. I've ultimately decided to go with e3 just because I think after f3 that I just feel that these kind of positions are coming a little bit stale and a little bit of a dead end for white. And I sort of get the impression that people playing as black are kind of, starting to kind of be prepared for these systems. Like, for example, I think it was, from memory, Benjamin Bock, who kind of showed this cool idea in one of his courses of just playing like bishop a6 and queen c7 and like just delaying castling to not let white get the attack. And honestly, I don't really have a great system against that. Like, if you go really deep with the engine, you can equalize, but I think it's pretty obvious that black is one who's kind of pressing. I think that is interesting to see in the database, like that actually on chess.com, white is actually winning most of the games from this position, which is not really something I expected. Like something like this, yeah, is actually okay. Once black castle, yeah, then the score more normalizes to what I was expecting, with black just having a pretty decent score from the positions. I mean, like in a practical game, you might still be able to make this work, but I just think that with CD4, if they know this Queen C4 move, like I just think black, yeah, just has like a perfectly comfortable position. And I feel like white's 3 out of 3 score on database, yeah, like it really relies on black not finding 8-6, which, considering bishop d5 is one of the main ideas in Sandwich, I'm kind of surprised that none of the free players on chess.com found this move and all end up just losing instead. But that's kind of the reason why I'm not as enthusiastic about f3 as some other creators, let's say. And also, I think with the move e3, I just kind of have more sort of interesting ideas to share in general. So that's kind of also why I want to go in that direction. But okay, at least you know the problem line with f3 if you do want to have another way of playing it as well. So most often, black plays the move of castles in the chess.com database. And then after bishop to d3, it's actually something I'm kind of noticing here that a lot of the players on chess.com, 2000 plus, still aren't really ready for this kind of system. But we do have some interesting ideas that we can play here as white. Because I'll show you. So the move I'm going to end up recommending is going to be rook to b1, but I do also want to explain a couple of alternatives because I'll kind of help us to understand why rook b1 is, I think, a very interesting idea for white. So in the old days, and also what white will usually play in practice, is going to be the move of knight e2 and going for something like e4 immediately, or after first castles, trying to sort of get in this bishop g5 and this really annoying pin on the knight for an attack. But if black does know the move knight e8, which is played by more than half the players on chess.com, then they're just going to be able to meet f4 of f5, and our attack is just really going to fall flat. And granted, it's true you can still like play this position, and I mean it's still going to be a an equal position with some ideas of being able to bring the to bring the knight around like rook e1 and this sort of thing. But it's very clear to me that black is also fairly comfortable. I'm actually a little bit surprised that white does have a little bit of a plus score in the chess.com database of 2000 plus. I would have expected would be black would have the plus score if anything. So it is still a legitimate enough approach. I just think that objectively it's just a very, very comfortable game, and I'm not sure if I'd feel comfortable recommending this kind of as a long-term weapon from White's point of view, because it does strike me as a little bit stale somehow. But if we do go back a little bit, there is also an interesting alternative of knight f3 that I do want to mention, because in the past this move was just thought to be a little bit of a mistake because it blocks e4, f4. But there is actually some logic to it, where you can play like e4 and kind of play it like a Hubner Nimzo with h3, where even though it's a Hubner where you have played the move of a3, so it's not as good a version of white as usual, you can still make the argument, white can still try to fight for an advantage. There are some ideas like bishop g5 and knight h4, where you can sort of try to bring the pieces to the attack on the king side. So for those who like these more slower strategic battles, there are ideas like this that you can definitely explore in your own time as a way to try to outplay the opponent. And I do think it is probably a bit easier for white to play that position. Now, black is not forced to play d6, but if they do play b6, it's actually going to run into e4, and the fact we have that pawn defended does actually give you some pretty decent chances for an advantage after e5. So that's another direction that you might like to explore in your own time. And Castles by Way is also a novelty in the chess.com database, so definitely something I think can really catch out your opponents. And if they do play d5, like we already kind of talked about how we're usually pretty happy to see the move of d5. Now, to be fair, this version, basically what happens is we ended up transposing into the Rubinstein Nimzo, actually, but transposing like this really old line with knight c3, 6a3 that you just don't really see anymore. But it is a version where white can fight for an advantage, so I do think that is an interesting move order, and it's something that I think if I was like playing this myself, like I actually would probably play the move knight f3 myself. But the one that scores the best in the database, and the one I think you'll like the most, is going to be the move of rook to b1. Because there are some very cool ideas of rook b1 I think will really be unpleasant for your opponents. Namely, after b6, the move that they usually play, the move of e4 is a really nice weapon. And the idea of e4, and the reason it sort of is a lot more effective here compared to the move before, is that if you play e4 in this position, you're going to run into d5, and then knight e4 is going to be very annoying. Because in a position like this, the problem is that you run into queen a5, and you're going to lose the right to castle, or you're going to lose your bishop pair, and either way, it's just a very sad position for white. Like black's got a much improved Grunfeld in a sense. And so instead of going for all of that, actually to be fair, DC4 is more precise. You don't need to, help white to, get the king to a good position, of course. But if we do go to this version here, you can kind of see the difference when I play b6. That now the move at d5 just doesn't really make a lot as much sense because you can now take, and because of their extra move at b6, they don't have queen a5 anymore, meaning that you are going to be able to fight for an advantage with the space and the bishop pair. It is interesting to see that on the chess.com that bishop g4 does score like a 2 out of 2 for black in the database, but I do think that we can improve on it pretty easily. Like if we do play out this game a little bit, like CD4, then yeah, you can also play like CD4 as well. But in the game, yeah, white played bishop e4, and like even though white lost the game, I do think that white had a pretty decent position out of the opening. Like you've got knight g3, you can take their pawn, and I mean, yeah, objectively, you go deep enough in the engine, black is going to be fine. But I do think, yeah, as far as worst case scenarios go, this is a pretty good one for white. And also, yeah, if they do play a bit differently, like knight e8 is the move that you'll tend to see more often. But then we can sort of see the benefit of having that flexibility with the knights, that we can now play a move like knight to f3, for example. And then if they go for a d6, we can even go e5 and not let them get that Hubner type of position, just having the space to really get some very good attacking chance against the king with the bishops, the space all kind of backing that up for us. And white does score 2 out of 2 on chess.com from that position. And if they play d6, then yeah, you can just go knight e2, and again you kind of have got in this useful move of rook b1, where like if they do play bishop a6, you can kind of go bishop g5 with this pin, and if they play knight to e8, you can just go for like this f4, and this insertion of these moves is kind of in white's favor because now after f5 you can still play moves like d5, and because of this d6, this square is not really defended properly compared to what we were seeing in the other line with these moves not included. So yeah, rook b1 has a lot of subtlety to it, and I understand you might have to watch this video a second time to grasp all of these details I'm showing you. But this is something that I think even title players will find a little bit unpleasant to play against, because all of the moves they're used to playing in the same is just kind of have different drawbacks to them as such. So with that, yeah, black kind of has to find some not so natural moves. And also, by the way, I should also explain that if they do play knight d4, because it's obviously a question, but then we can just go e5, and the trap we have is that we just play bishop to e4, and we actually just win a piece. because knight c6 we just take, and obviously I can't take back because the queen is undefended. So that's the final salty. That's good to know there. With that, that really shows you the ideas of rook b1, and I'm pretty confident, yeah, that it's going to be very unpleasant for your opponents with these kind of ideas that were only really developed in the last like 3 or 4 years or so. So it's a very fresh thing, and if your opponent's relying on some old repertoire like book or course for the Nimso, then this is very likely going to catch them a bit by surprise. I think it was Alexander Grishuk, I think, was the one who was starting to play Rook B1, and then there was like a Ding Nepo game in the database. That was kind of where it started to become better known. But that does explain a little bit why you will often see Black play other moves, like try to play for D6 or delay to move Knight C6. The thing is, though, you can then just play E4 without even needing to play Rook B1. Just kind of gives you a better than usual version of a Hubner Nimso, because the Knight's obviously a lot more flexible on E2 than F3. And you can even just go for an expansion on the king side, which just gives you a really, really good attack against their king, while they don't really have the equivalent counterplay on the queen side to compensate for it. So just something like this is just going to be very, very nice for white. Not even letting him get in F5 counterplay to fight back against our bishops and then against our space. Moving to a few other ways they can play it. If they do play b6 here, again, just e4, like a lot of times e4 is just going to be really strong if they don't kind of fight for the control of the center. And a lot of the ideas here just kind of overlap in that sense. So if they play knight c6, again, you can see that it's probably just going to transpose anyway to sort of familiar kind of territory. If they do play d6, it's surprisingly common actually how often black will play this sort of Hubner's approach in practice. But I just think that, yeah, with knight g3, that this is quite a nice way to play. We make it harder for them to get in the move of e4. But you also keep some flexibility where, if they do try to grab a pawn like this, it just turns out you just have really strong play with your bishops on the open board. To the point where actually white is probably already clearly better in a position like this, just with even natural moves like rook e1, h3, bishop b1. You don't really need to force a direct attack. You can kind of just build up the attack, and black is just going to have a really hard time resisting the pressure on the dark squares in the long term, and some of the other weaknesses that they have here. So that's a bit of a deeper point, but one I think it was important to explain. And I mean, if rook e8, yeah, you can even just play like there's various moves that are going to be a little bit better for white, like d5 and queen c2 is kind of the one that probably gives you the most advantage. We can kind of go f4 and sort of hit back against their structure like this. You don't have to play it immediately. Like you can also just improve the position steadily in a kind of Akiba Rubinstein kind of style. So you definitely can be patient as well. Because again, black doesn't really have a break. It doesn't have counterplay when it can't play f5, e4, or b5 properly in a position like this. Let's say, just very prophylactic. Just keep the control, and what can black do? So with that, I think that covers this sort of knight c6 and also the best move for black, which is only played in 40% of the games, is the move b6. But this is where I want to actually show a really cool idea that I actually did cover in a previous video of mine, but it was on a video of like how old players should play chess. I know it's kind of a funny topic, but I noticed that this move at e4 has only been played in it's only been played in 8 games on chess.com out of what's the number we have here, like about 4,000 games. So it's very unlikely your opponent will have seen it before, but it does allow us to kind of steer towards some of those positions that we were sort of looking at just beforehand. Obviously, the big question is what if they take on e4, but then we go queen to g4, and at this point, black probably should play the move of knight to f6. The move of f5 is kind of what I focused on a little bit more in that video I did on YouTube previously. I mean, to be fair, they can also, play. Just bear with me one sec. They also can play the move of bishop b7 and play this endgame, but you'll kind of see this is a general idea we're aiming for, just to get this endgame, which, yeah, I mean, it's not like we're objectively better here by any means as white. But, you do have the bishop pair advantage, you do have a bit of space to work with, and so I think as far as creative systems go, it's not such a bad choice, and it's also not really something that the engine kind of really takes so seriously. So it's definitely, I think, has that surprise effect and something that, yeah, your opponent will not really have looked at most likely. The move knight f6 is what you'll probably see more often, where you just get this quite nice play, of course, with the bishop and all. But I do think there are ways you can still play as white. Like you can go for either knight f3 and just play this position with the bishops against the knights. That yeah, like the computer will say that the black is doing quite well here, but I do think that with our bishop pair, we definitely have ideas to set problems for black. I think it's not as definitely not as simple without the engine telling you what to do. Let's put it like this. Like it only takes one mistake from black, and we go like h4 and bishop g5 and really start to make their life difficult. Now, if they play a little bit differently, I mean, we could also play like move like f3 and just shut out the bishop like that. Which I mean, the engine's not as enthusiastic on as it kind of prefers knight f3. But yeah, those kind of the choices you can play. Like this is again the sort of worst case scenario from White's perspective, and I think with the bishop pair, we do have that imbalance needed to be able to outplay the opponent is in a practical game. So with that, yeah, that's e4. This is the idea that kind of sort of convinced me to sort of recommend this in the end. Because otherwise, yeah, if black gets in this bishop b7, it does avoid some of those move orders that we were going for before. So e4 is kind of my counter to black being smart with the move order. And to kind of just wrap up the Nimzo coverage real quick, if they do play castles here, I mean the best move for white objectively is probably to play f3, but that is going to transpose back into the Kmok variation with 4 f3. But it's still, if you get an e4, I do think you have a pretty good position. And if they play f5, it's kind of heading back towards some of those ideas I was showing before, like with bishop d3 92 and playing this a very much in the spirit of the Botvinnik Kasparov setup. We prepare the e4 break from here. Just very, very systematic. And if they don't find the move of b6 and bishop a6, they're going to very quickly be in very hot water strategically. So, and if they do play bishop f5, like you've also got ideas like g4 and just going for the pawn storm. Again, a lot like we've kind of seen before, but where the bishop probably is better on c1 than f4 in these positions. So again, using those kind of familiar ideas. If they play c5, you just kind of get a much better version of the positions we were just looking at. Like we already kind of looked at these sort of positions where the pawn was on f2 rather than f3, which really doesn't change a whole lot. If anything, it's probably just good for us. And if they do play a move like knight to e8 to try to avoid the bishop g5 pin, then I mean, if they try to play like in the other line, I just think that you just get a really strong, attack with knight h3, and it just kind of gives you a much improved version of the usual same-ish line. So you can look at it more deeply yourself if you want to. But like at the end of the day, I think white is just better in a position like this one, and just going for the attack directly against the king. In any case, let's now move to what if they play the move of b6 or knight c6 first. They can also use that move order, but you're basically going to get this sort of thing if your opponent kind of knows what they're doing. Now, to be fair, in the chess.com database, only 70% of players at 2000 plus were playing knight c6, so it's they might just more likely play some other move that just kind of leads to better versions of positions we looked at before. But knight c6 is kind of the bigger question, and the engines kind of like to play knight a5 these days, but the move of bishop a6 is probably the one that you'll see a little bit more often. Just showing you this pawn Saka Fallujah, and that he used to beat Wesley So a year or two ago, in case you want to explore that for yourself. But bishop a6 is the move you're more likely to see, and I think after bishop g5, like I used to play this as black about nearly 20 years ago. I was kind of playing it because it was recommended in the book, but I do think that white just has a little bit easier play here. Like you're going to get usually a position like this one, where after knight to h5, you can just go h4 and you can sacrifice the pawn, but you get this really strong play on the king side, just exploiting the weaknesses they created. For example, if they go bishop g4, like that's the most common move by far, but it's actually going to be quite a big mistake. They usually go queen g5 because otherwise they end up losing a piece to takes and g4, and we end up just winning a piece like that. But as it happens, queen g5 does allow knight h3, and whatever black does is just can't really sort of harmonize the pieces properly. Like after queen g6, we can just play g4, takes, and we just have this very dominant long-term initiative. Like both knight f4 and bishop h4 are both going to be quite good. But the engine kind of likes going knight f4 and this sort of funny knight to g2 move. It just kind of preparing bishop h4 and kicking the queen back. And what's going to happen in a position like this is that black just doesn't have anywhere for the king to go, right? Like you just go bishop h4. And a position like this is just complete strategic domination. The king will be stuck here for the rest of the game. And I think, yeah, you don't have to be Mikhail Tal to, win from such a position as white. So that's, yeah, kind of the trick that obviously black shouldn't take on c4. Like they need to find this difficult move of a5 to avoid just losing. But there are various ways to keep an advantage, like even just, something like this with similar ideas to what we saw before. Like, it's not winning for white, but I think it's pretty obvious that you are going to be better in a position like this when their king is just going to be unsafe for the remainder of the game, and we just have that initiative and long-term central space advantage to work with. That really does, I think, conclude the picture I want to share on the Samish Nimzo, and as you can see, it's a system that I think a lot of players, including myself in the past, didn't really take it that seriously because it's always had not a very good reputation. But there are these modern engine ideas that have revolutionized it, and I do really believe that if you are looking for attacking chances against the Nimzo, that A3 is going to give you the best chances of getting that initiative and that strong attack using some of the ideas that I've just shown you. And with that coverage complete, we can now move to something you'll face nearly as often as e6 in the sort of King's Indian and Grunfeld complex. And when I was checking the database of players rated 2000 plus on chess.com just out of interest, it was intriguing to see that White's best scoring move was not the automatic knight c3, which obviously allows the Grunfeld defense from Black. Which I mean, you'll face the King's Indian, quite a bit more, but obviously Grunfeld is also well, argue probably even a more reliable opening than the King's Indian. But the point is that we can actually avoid the Grunfeld altogether, and White's best scoring move with a quite nice 50% win rate in the database is actually the move of h4. Okay, to be fair, actually the move of h3 does score like 0.5% better, this sort of anti-Grunfeld system, but I've gone with the move h4 here because I think it's a fun line with a little bit more surprise value. Because like if you're playing a King's Indian player, you're going to kind of just be generally transposing back into a Samish King's Indian anyway. And given I've played the Samish King's Indian quite a lot as a junior, I'm kind of saving up more for a future video where I share some of my personal experiences in that opening, because I think that's just going to resonate more than just throwing statistics at you. But after h4, kind of the point is that now the move of d5 is not going to be so effective for black. There are also other moves like h5 is another move we'll get to a little bit later, but if they do play d5, the problem is that we just kind of get... It's sort of like we saw with the Marshall defense before. You can just go e4, and yeah, I mean, you can even go h5, and just the position is just really horrible for black, where we can even go for like either hg6 and attack down the h-file if they castle short, and times you have moves like h6 as well just to really mess things up with their bishop. So we can basically see that we have avoided the Grunfeld by playing it this way. And after bishop g7, we are going to play knight c3. Sacking the pawn is going to be a little bit too nebulous. And the point is that after d6, we're going to kind of transpose in this King's Indian with this funny move h4 that is actually not as bad as it looks, as it turns out. But if they do play a move such as d5, I do think we should cover what happens if they do try to play the Grunfeld. Well, this is where we have a little bit of a trick that... It's kind of funny, actually. I learned this trick from a completely different order of moves over 20 years ago from Secrets of Opening Surprises. They end up coming from a different move order there, but basically this h5 is a really good move in this position. The point being that if they take with the knight, you can then just play cd5 and you just have the free pawns in the center, while black's pieces, are no longer so effective for the attack. Like in a position like this, you can even just play e4, and if they take, you can actually just sack the pawn with e5, which is not maybe the move that you were expecting, but it negates that pressure against d4. We're threatening to win the knight with g4 already, and if they do play bishop f8 to clear that retreat for the knight, well, we can even just switch back to playing normally, and we just have this vastly improved version of a French defense where we are way ahead in development. We have a really strong attack with pretty natural moves, and if you ask the computer, it turns out White's actually just basically winning in this position. which again might seem a bit surprising, but that just shows you that this is going to be a bit more of a strategic trap than a tactical trap. Or more precise, it's more of like a tactical trap with strategic consequences, which is definitely something that can very easily catch out our opponents. And this is just showing you the most common moves from black in the database, so that's obviously a good sign for us. And if they do play knight f6 again, just e4, and I mean, if they play c6, like now you can kind of play takes with impunity because you can now go d5, and it's kind of like the boar attack, but just a much better version where you're just getting the pawn storm, and this doesn't really fit in the boar attack, obviously. So yeah, it's nice to get an improved version of something familiar, as it were. With that, I'm going to move to what happens if they play a little bit differently. Like, what if they play? I mean, a move such as castles, I would probably just play like takes bishop h6 and just go for the attack on the king, and I think that's just going to give you a very pleasant advantage. Like you just castle long, queen at knight f3. Those moves I think are pretty natural from White's point of view. And if they do try to grab a pawn, then I'm pretty happy with White's chances. Like you just play it as a pawn sack, and it's not like Black is going to be enjoying life here to kind of put it mildly. So as it were, going back a little bit earlier. If they do play GH5, then yeah, you can just play CD5, and obviously this position like this, Black's not even getting in the usual C5 because the rook is covering it, and they can't really castle because of the king being so exposed. So this is just to demonstrate that if Black does try to play Grunfeld, they just don't get any of their usual counterplay, and White does just have a very obvious advantage after the move of H5. So after D6 and E4, this is going to be where I'll focus more of my attention. Because after castles, I will say if you are playing against more like high level opponents, like playing against titled players, you will see them often play moves like knight c6 and sort of try to sort of delay or avoid the move of castling. So that is something that is also worth mentioning for those who really want to go a lot deeper into these positions. But we're going to focus on castles because that is technically the most common move, especially when you include transpositions. And if you want something that's a little bit less theoretical in bishop e2, which I think is the best move for white, I will mention that h5 is a kind of interesting gambit. Like, it's not as bad in this version compared to some of the other ones. Like, you are actually going to get pretty good compensation of, like, f4. And, the plan is just going to be to kind of put the queen on the h file and just go for this attack. I'm not going to say white's better. Like, I think if black plays precisely, they're able to equalize. Like, they're meant to play rook e8. But the thing is, in 52 games at the 2000 plus level on chess.com, like not a single player played rook to e8, which kind of tells me that this is actually going to be quite a nice practical weapon and something you could definitely explore in your own time. You just go queen c2, like play d5, and like you're just going to play very natural attacking moves. There's nothing too fancy, I think, about this from White's perspective. It's like this kind of like a nice four pawns attack where we just have a much bigger lead in development, and Black is a lot more passive than usual. So yeah, this one, it's one under you play at your own risk. This is obviously completely unexplored territory, just completely. And then there are other moves like 92 and like other ones you could also explore as well. But yeah, that's kind of the picture from this perspective. And if they don't find Rookie 8, yeah, I think White is probably actually just going to be better. So that's obviously good news for us. Like, C5, D5, this sort of thing. And if they play E6, yeah, you can just take the pawn back. I know that's a trick I've caught out a lot of players with in different versions on chess.com. So maybe it'll happen for you as well. But going back a little bit to some possible alternatives. Also, they can play 98. Like, knight h5 bishop b2 is just obviously going to be bad for black, but 98 is also another move they can play. And then if you want a really computerish idea, I will mention the move of queen to... You can kind of do it a few different ways, but queen e2 is the one I kind of like where... and this is also a novelty in chess.com database, by the way, where you're just going to sacrifice with this and, go g8-6, and you just get a really interesting attacking position, where I do think white is going to be somewhat better with some fairly natural developing moves to build up the attack. So again, nice creative approach, something that no one has really been taking all that seriously. But I do really like White's practical chances with this h5 move. Because also if they don't take, if they try to, just bail out. You're just going to kind of get a much better version of some of the positions we'll see in the bishop e2 line because of the pawn. So I'm going to cover bishop e2 as well, just because I think it is good to have a few different ways of playing these systems, so that if one move just doesn't please you anymore, or you just want the variety, well, a lot of the ideas that we see with bishop e2 are also going to apply in the other version. So it's really good to get that understanding in that way. And here there's kind of three main moves that black will usually go for in practice. Again, I'm not going to cover every single little thing first because it would make the video very long. And second, my back sometimes get a bit sore from doing so much recording, even in a chair as comfy as this one. Probably need a pillow at some point, actually, just, support my back, or, just have like massages every day for like this rate of recording. But the three main moves we're going to focus on are going to be c5, is going to be sort of my main line. We're also going to touch on e5, and we're going to touch on h5 as well. And I think actually I want to start with the move h5 because that's probably one of the more obvious questions you might have had is, well, what if white just plays like h5 and doesn't let us get this h5 attack in? Well, there's actually a couple of good responses we have. Like knight to f3 is probably the simplest one, I would say, but you can also play an improved Averbach King's Indian, where it's kind of hard for them to get rid of their bishop with h6 now. Meaning that, for example, a move like c5, which, in the position with the pawn being able to play h6, this would be fine for black. But now in this version, you actually have some really cool ideas like g4, where you can even use the hook to just have a really strong attack. Like, I'll admit this is like very, very computerish, so you probably want to check it yourself to, to understand why it works before you like play it in an actual game. But there are ideas like this where you can kind of just punish the opponent's most natural moves and actually get a pretty crushing advantage right out of the opening, just with that idea of g4 as an alternative to just developing quietly and saying you just have a good Benoni. Now, if they do play, there are other moves they can also play, but again, kind of the point is that knight d7, you can basically just transition to a really good structure where the fact they can't play f5 so easily due to the bishop, this h5 being played and this hole on g5, doesn't mean at the end of the day black just doesn't really have any counterplay in a position like this one. Okay, the computer points out you can just show off with g4 and even just start to just mate them on the king side, which is kind of funny because in the king's Indian, normally black is the one trying to attack on the king side, and in these h4 lines we're the ones doing attacking. But let's say if you forget and you just play like natural moves like knight d2 and you just play like something very sort of quiet and thematic. Like, I mean, this is also going to give white an advantage because, like I said before, this f5, f4 is just nowhere near as effective when they played h5 and we haven't castled short. So there's kind of, again, a nice thing that our sub is kind of forgiving in terms of being able to punish our opponent's mistakes and play the rising positions. But yeah, if you do take the move knight f3, like just if we compare a move like e5, for instance, the thing is that normally in the King's Indian, a move like bishop g5 would sort of be a mistake because of f6, but it does start to make a lot more sense when they can't kick the bishop away and you just have the pin. Probably the simpler approach though is just to play d5 and just play a vastly improved version of the Petrosian King's Indian, because in the Petrosian it's all about them being able to get in counterplay of f5 at the right moment, and with the knight on g5 they're just not really getting that. Meaning that again, a position like this is just much better for white. Your moves are also, very natural, like queen e2, long castles, prepared g4, and just be much, much better. So again, you can see how we really are able to throw black off, where they can't just try to bring things back to a normal King's Indian, because h5 does have very far-reaching consequences, first with the weakness of g5, and second with not being able to play the critical f5 break in the future. And that's kind of the reason why c5 really is the move that is going to be the best one for black. Other moves like will just give white a very pleasant advantage, like, knight c6, d5. Or if they play the move e5, again, this is just going to be a really good version of some lines we've seen. Because like if you take the h3 Makoganov lines or the Sami Averbach ones, like a lot of the times you're playing h4, h5 anyway there as white. And so in this case, you basically just have a much improved version of familiar territory. The most common move is h5 in the database. We've already kind of seen why that is, why that has a lot of problems for black in this case. And if they do play c6, which is the second most common, you just go h5, and you're basically aiming for a position kind of like this one, where you can, I mean, you can play g4 as well if you want to, but I really like the move of h6. And you just make this bishop a really bad piece, and you've got this pawn that just means that it's just very hard for black to get any counterplay. Like if they go f5, it just gives us a beautiful outpost on g5 for the knight. And like I would absolutely hate to play this kind of position as a King's Indian player because you're just getting absolutely none of the usual counterplay. Like you can even show off and just switch to playing on the light squares if you really want to, just really playing against their bishop on the dark squares. So there's ideas like that are not necessary, but they are a way to be able to maximize your advantage and just leave black with a strategically unplayable game. And so for that reason, really, c5 is going to be the big question. If black wants to equalize, it's going to be with this c5 continuation. Usually black plays a move of e6 at this point. If they don't play e6, it's going to be something like a Benko or a move like h5 that I might play. But we've already kind of talked about these sort of positions, why white is just going to be a lot better here. And with the Benko, it's not the worst idea to try to play a Benko where he played h4. The thing is that I think it's still going to be quite a nice position for white, where we kind of got an e4 in one go. And even just a move like a4, for example, I think is going to be a very nice way to keep control, because like queen a5, you just go bishop d2 and break the pin. And if they do play their usual a b5 and bishop a6 sort of thing, I mean, you can even again just play like bishop d2, and a really nice strategic idea is just to take back with the a pawn and just kind of use that a pawn to really shut down their counterplay down the b file, and even just play kind of natural moves to white. You're going to see that white is just going to be quite comfortably better with an extra pawn, and black not getting the usual counterplay that they would hope for in these positions. Often later in the game, you're going to play an e5 push to sort of attack their structure, but you also are just comfortably better. Like you can definitely take your time here as white. There's no reason to rush. You just keep improving the position. So with that, we can go back a little bit to the bigger question of what if they play e6. And once again, we play the move h5, and after takes, you actually kind of have a couple of choices you can kind of go for. Like you can also play a move like h6 first, flicking that in, uh, and then e takes d5, and you can also play the move cd5 immediately. So there are a few different approaches you can go for. I will say though, after cd5, I do think the move b5 is one that does give black very nice play. Like black has a very promising score in the database. Like if you want to make this work, I would probably explore the move e5, which is only played in one chess.com game before. And I mean, the engine says white's slightly better, though I do have a feeling if you go deeper that it's probably going to go a little bit closer to equality. But definitely this is one way you can ask some practical questions and, ask like a few tricky questions in these positions. Like there's a few different subs you can go for depending on your feeling, but I'll let you explore that in your own time if you wish. But the move I'm going to really focus on is going to be the move of e takes d5. Usually they play the move of rook e8 by far is the most common. And once again, you have a few different options. Like you can play h6 and then play the move of bishop to g5, just try and make it hard for him to get there. Counterplay with knight to e4. And the engine does think white is a little bit better in this position, at least on a lower depth on chess.com. Like I said, if I was using chess base, I'd be able to look at much deeper cloud engine analysis. So, with these engine values, obviously you might take it with a small grain of salt, but if they play queen b6, we can just play b3, and we do have some fun ideas where we can basically sacrifice the exchange, because if they take it, they just end up getting mated on g7. So you've got some ideas like that that kind of allow you to put some pressure, like knight d7, knight f3, and I do think white is just a bit better because of the extra space and that pawn just causing a lot of long-term problems for the black king, as it were. You could also start with rook c1 as well if you don't want to sack the exchange, but I do think that I would probably rather not allow something like this, so that's why I'm kind of saying knight h3 is going to be the move more so. In any case, going back to a bit earlier, if they play queen a5, I would just play queen to d2 or king f1. Like both moves are going to be a little bit better for white, by just avoiding knight e4 as a way to keep a bit more control over the position. And also there are other alternatives, like you can also play a move such as king to f1 and keep a little bit more flexibility. So that, for example, if knight bd7, that you can kind of play it in a similar way. Like it's not necessarily a transposition, because in this version you can meet queen b6 with rook b1. There's kind of an extra option that wouldn't have made as much sense in the earlier version, because if you try to play rook b1 here, then you're going to run into bishop f5. Like that's going to really be the key difference with this king f1 move. Where it keeps that flexibility where like bishop f5 is going to run into problems with g4. But if they play this, then we can defend the pawn without running into bishop f5. We can also just develop our pieces very naturally and again just use our space to kind of squeeze black. And so that's sort of the conclusion I'm coming to, is that I actually am really struggling to find a way for black to find very clear-cut equality in this position. And that's obviously a very good sign that, me, even though obviously if I was using the check cloud engine on chess base, it would probably say at depth 60, black is able to equalize with these moves. Certainly, I think these sort of, even though it's not as strong an engine, it's probably more indicative of how the position is going to feel on a practical level, kind of playing it as white and black. And so I think we can be pretty happy with the work that we have that we have done here in exploring these positions. But I think this does also explain why it is that a lot of top players do prefer to play a move like knight c6, because that is, I think, going to give black better chances of equality. You do have to watch out for things like e5 and knight d4. Like you definitely don't want to fall asleep at the wheel here. But in this case, there are kind of a couple of ways you can play it. Like one that looks kind of weird is to play a move like knight f3 and just kind of play something like this, saying that h4 is still going to be a somewhat useful move in some positions. And this one actually could work quite well for you probably in practice, because most people play knight e5 and just let white just get this much better position where the double pawns really give black no real counterplay whatsoever in this kind of structure. Something like this is just going to be very, very depressing for black to play, with white just being better on every side of the board. And if they do play something else like, I mean, I guess bishop g4 is a much more common move than castles, to be fair. But here as well, I think you can still play moves such as d5 and play a structure like this where like you can gf3 and just get some very strong attacking chances. Probably instead, black should play like the less common knight f3, and black kind of has to find this computerish move with bishop h5 to have a reasonable game. But if you look at the database, like white is winning nearly all of the games in the chess.com 2000 plus level, which already is kind of telling you that the position, even though a computer says it's fine, it's always just going to be a lot easier to play white on the sort of practical point of view. Whether that's we're playing f4 or queen d2 or queen c2. Like all those moves, I think are going to be pretty good for white with fairly similar sort of ideas. We have the central space. We're not just reliant on playing h5, right? So going back a bit, if they do, I do want to mention some alternatives. Like you can also play a move such as knight g2, which is actually the best scoring move, or one of the better scoring moves for white in the database. It does mean that black can play castles, and you're sort of saying that you have this kind of worse version of a same-ish in the sense that you have played the move h4 a little bit too early, but you're also saying it's an improved version because they played the move knight c6, which is not one of the better lines against the same-ish. So for someone like me who has kind of a lot of experience playing these sorts of same-ish positions, like I would, be pretty happy playing this as white. Like I'd argue that, white does have some decent chance for an advantage based on the game played between Sam Shanklin against Peter Svidler many, many years ago in a FIDE World Cup. But that's something, again, you can explore it yourself if you're so inclined. I will say d5 is probably the direction I would focus on, because these positions, even though the engine will say that white is better here, they are a little bit tricky to keep control in. So just keep that in mind, that there's some counterintuitive moves like king f2 that you kind of need to find to keep an advantage here as white, for example. But okay, that's going maybe a little bit into the weeds of it. Also, the move d5 is another interesting one. We can kind of just go for bishop e2 and just switch to kind of normal sort of play, where again you sort of just castle and argue that this is not one of the better options for black. I mean, in this case, black does have moves like c6 they can play. Like that's probably the way in which black should try to fight for equality. Something like this is, yeah, I mean, not going to be too bad for black. Like I think it's still quite a bit easier to play white. But yeah, there is approach like h5 they can play to try to solve their problems. So that can be a tip from Black's perspective in this case. But overall, yeah, we can just see that with this h4 move, that it's just kind of hard for Black to sort of get a normal kind of King's Indian position. Like if they try to play like a Benoni, we have this h5, h6. Their usual e5 plan doesn't really work either, and there's also some disadvantages to playing h5 with the g5 square that we talked about. I think with that we can really sort of understand why this h4 move is scoring so well for white. And if they do play c5, like just to mention one other thing real quick, if they do play the move of b5 here, then in this case, like it is true they avoided the e4 move. But I think that you can still play like e3, and even though h4 is obviously not what you're really playing normally in a Benko, I think even in this version you can still fight for a small edge as white. But again, I'll leave it for you to explore this in your own time if if you want to go deeper. But I do think something like this is going to give white a little bit of a pull for what it's worth. Where I think h4 is not necessarily less useful than bishop e2, which would be the normal, or rook a3, which would be kind of the normal moves for white in these variations. In any case, let's go back to what about some of the sidelines? Like, what if they don't play e6, and what if they don't play g6 here? And what if they do something like c5 or e5 or d6, for example? Let's have a bit of a look at some of those. So after c5 and d5, in my experience, you're going to face the Benko Gambit more often than you're going to face the Benoni. But we're obviously going to touch on both of them, and I'm actually going to touch on the Benoni first, just because it is something you could also get from this move order, for example. So based on that, it is something you might face more often if you count the alternative move orders to get there. But in this case, like if they play their usual Benoni stuff, one stuff that I actually do quite like for white, I've been playing it for some time and having some pretty good results with it, is going to be the setup with knight g to e2. And the idea of it is that you're basically just playing an improved version of a same-ish variation, because you didn't have to play the move of f3. And you're just able to keep control of the position very, very nicely, in my opinion. Like castles. I mean, you can always play a move like f3 later, like if you have some experience with the same, you can just play it and transpose back to familiar territory. But if not, there are other moves you can play that are probably even more promising, like, for example, in this position, the Indian really likes the move of h3, just as a way to kind of play a bit prophylactically, like keeping options open as to whether you go bishop g5 or where you play rook e1, and you can explore it more deeply yourself. But I just think that in a position like this, I just don't really see where black's counterplay is coming from. And I mean, if they play h5, you can just go bishop g5, and they're not even really getting in the move h4 so readily. So you can see it's just going to be a very, very pleasant advantage for white. So with that, yeah, it's just hard to know what black should really do about it, honestly. Like, if they play... One thing they can try to do is they can try to play moves like h5, but I just find it's not really that effective. Like, you can go bishop to e2 and, h4, knight f1, and you still have just a very harmonious position, where, like, this pawn being on h3 just isn't really helping him. It's just more of a weakness than anything else, and, we can even just castle safely later without anything to worry about, because they just don't have the development to back up their attack. The move of h5 on move 7 might actually be one of the better tries for black. It's not something you're really going to face very much, though, and, again, you can also play bishop g5, like we do have some flexibility where we're not forced to play knight g3, like there are other ways to bring the knight around as well here, like c1, for example. So you can kind of just adapt yourself and just keep an advantage as white that way. But yeah, black doesn't really have a way to equalize against knight g2, and even though knight g2 is not going to give you as big of an advantage as the flick knife attack or time out of attack with bishop to b5. Still, I mean, it is. This is a line where if someone's playing Benoni, chances are they are going to have some ideas ready with knight at d7. Even though white is clearly better, they're going to have some ideas to try to at least make the position kind of interesting. Then might catch us a little by surprise. Whereas with knight g2, we're kind of putting them in our sort of territory instead. And so that's, just a very nice system against the Benoni and against the Benko. It's actually kind of an interesting situation of what to recommend against the Benko that's creative, because the Benko was the opening that I struggled the most against when playing d4 as a junior and as a teenager. I kind of changed my mind a lot of times on what systems to play before learning it as black, and that was the only way I really got comfortable with it, was by really studying it deeply from black's perspective, so I could see the ideas from both sides' point of view. One system I was playing quite a bit in my later teens was this move of Queen to C2, which is actually the second most popular move in the database, believe it or not, at 2000 plus level. And the idea was just to go e4 and just kind of get a position like this where you just would develop very quietly and just kind of have a small advantage. Like you'd play, moves such as rook to e1 or h3 or knight c3. Like you had all these different moves you could play that all gave you a bit of an advantage with fairly natural moves. And there's some strategic ideas like playing knight a3 and just taking knight to c4. So that if they tried to go here, you could then sort of bring your knight to c6. So there were sort of concepts like this are just like very easy to execute and just giving white quite a nice advantage. That being said, there are some alternatives black can play, like the move of e6, for example. It's a bit of a rare move, but it does probably give black slightly better chances to equalize. Though I would still say white probably is still a little bit better here anyway. One idea that back then I was always playing bishop c4, but I will mention that knight c3 and e5 is actually a little bit of a trap that you might like to explore in your own time. Because the most common move on chess.com is d4, and then they kind of realize too late that after queen e4, they just lose the house. So that's a little bit of a trap here. It can definitely catch out somebody. Obviously, not forced to play ed5, but this is just to show the most common moves from Black's point of view and how to punish it. And the line is probably the better one for Black is going to be to play b4 here. And in that case, yeah, you can play like e4, f4, and this is the way I was kind of playing it, just playing it in quite an ambitious fashion. Like I remember beating this club player Tom Kalish in a game in 2008 SIO from this position. I mean, I do think Black is objectively probably fine here. Like the move e6 is the move they kind of need to play before we can like get an e5 and just take over the game. So they do kind of need to fight back here as Black. And yeah, I mean, there's different moves you can play. Like you can play h3 is kind of one that the engine sort of likes a low depth, and then sort of bring a knight to c4 from there. Again, Black is fine, but they do have to find some slightly precise moves in order to, to prove that they managed to equalize in the end. And White does score pretty well from this position in the database. If you look a bit deeper into it, like it's a small plus score for White. Let's put it this way. But as I said, if they're in fine a5, you are kind of just better here with some pretty natural moves. Something like this just to give an example is just going to be a kind of better version of the other line where we don't have the bishop stuck on c1 compared to those a5 lines from before. And yeah, there's also other moves like even rook e1 is also quite decent. Where you kind of just argue you don't even need to stop the move bishop to b4, and you can kind of just play like knight bd2 instead. But okay, it turns out probably the best move is just to play h3 and transpose anyway. So yeah, that's just a way in which you can solve that problem. And yeah, I think that actually, now that I've sort of shown it, I don't think I'm going to go with Queen C2 as my recommendation, even though it's not the best scoring move. It does still have a better score for white in the database than C B5, which is a lot closer to 50% score overall. If you do want to refine this, you can also play a move like Knight F3 and then Queen C2. And the sort of the idea is that you're just avoiding that E6 move and kind of forcing him into these kind of positions that we saw a bit earlier. And if they play b4, this is kind of the drawback of it, is that you don't have that plan of f4, that more ambitious one we saw previously. So it does mean these positions are a little bit more dry, and that is an argument in favor of playing the move queen c2 first to have that bit of extra flexibility. Also, if they do play something like g6, then it turns out that this is just going to be just an extra pawn. Like you just get a way better version than usual of the um of the normal Benko Gambit. Because basically what happens is you kind of have the E3 system where you're playing like E4 often a second move later, but you basically just got this extra tempo of Queen C2 compared to other lines of the Benko that you're already going to be good for white. This just kind of makes it even better. Again, one idea if you want to sort of play it like more sort of strategically, there is this kind of interesting idea of Rook A3, which I just want to just check it just to make sure this does actually work. But yeah, you can play it this way and are able to use the b3 pawn to neutralize a lot of their counterplay, as we see here. There is also another approach, like if you want a maximum advantage, you can also just castle and just let them take, because they're not really getting in knight b4 anyway, so they just don't have any sort of compensation for the pawn if we do just play kind of normal healthy moves like knights on b5, c4, and b3 really is the dream setup for white against the Benko Gambit. So that's the one that yeah gives you an even bigger advantage if you are happy just to play in a kind of normal Benko position, but where they just don't get any of their counterplay. So with that, yeah, I think we can move on to other systems. Like I do realize there are things like E5 and the sort of D6, G6 systems, but like E5 just doesn't really have a very good reputation. Like you can just sort of pick a system that feels natural to you. Like for example, when I was like a junior, I was just playing G3 and like just playing just some very simple systems that were just giving a very nice advantage. So yeah, just not really something that would bother me whatsoever. And if they do play something like D6, G6, like obviously you can even just play the move of H4 if you want to, and just play it like we were seeing before. Or you can just play like knight E2 because they're probably going to play E6 anyway, and again it's going to transpose into your line against the modern Benoni. So you can kind of just like pick whichever one just sort of feels more natural to you between the two. And that really concludes the picture on C5. I feel like the Budapest Gambit's one of these openings that I never really kind of understood what the sort of attraction for it was, other than just kind of essentially avoiding Fury and playing a Gambit. But at this point, the system that actually scores the best white in the database at the 2000 plus level is not going to be the main lines like Bishop F4 or Knight F3, but it's actually going to be the move of E3 followed by the move of Knight to H3. This actually has a very nice score of like 57% win rate in the database. It is also an idea that came from the Secrets of Opening Surprises books from over 20 years ago. But the thing is, your plan is just very clear. You're just going to put the knight on f4, you're going to castle your king, and you're just going to say that you're better with the extra space. And in practice, Black hasn't really been very impressive in dealing with it. Like the most common move in the database is knight c6, but I think that's just a mistake to let white have such a strong grip over the d5 square. And yeah, I mean, I just think in a position like this, white is just going to be having a very clear and very comfortable advantage, like castles, bishop e2, and I mean, you're just playing normal moves and just having a really big edge. You can even just play b3, and like it's very hard to know really where black's play is coming from. Whereas we can very easily put the knight on d5, expand in the center, expand on the queen side. It's just very obvious that white has all the ideas in this kind of position. Also, sometimes go knight b5 and use the weakness of a5 to your advantage. But yeah, this is really not a position that black should really feel happy about playing. And yeah, that's what happens in the most common moves from black from this point. And if they go bishop b4 again, just bishop d2, kind of like we saw, just very similar sorts of ideas. And while they don't have to, play the move of, let's say, d6, of like knight c6 and make our life easy, like even if they do put the knight on d7, we still have a very similar type of advantage. Something like this is, yeah, just again, very easy to play. Like it's very obvious what our plans are, like just slowly expanding on the queen side, getting the pieces to kind of back it up. So with that, yeah, you can kind of feel that black is having a bit of a hard time dealing with this knight h3 move in practice. If they do want to fight for equality, their best options are probably either to go d6 and play it sort of like a King's Indian, or to play it more spicy with d5 and argue they're going to get some decent compensation for the pawn. I think either way, white's still going to be a little bit better, but these positions are probably the direction that that black should be exploring against our system. It actually just occurred to me also, like I was wondering if you could play knight h3 first and even play it this way, but you are probably going to play the move of e3 anyway. So knight h3 would have a bit more shock value, but it would just transpose. So yeah, while this is not going to give you objectively the biggest advantage against a Budapest if they play like a computer, we can see that we do get just an absolute dream position against the most common and most natural moves of the opponent. And I think when it comes to a repertoire like this, that is going to ultimately be more effective and give you better results than just trying to play the top engine move every time and making it a little bit overwhelmed by the range of choice. Now, the move of d6 is sort of known as the Old Indian, where obviously if they play g6, it's going to kind of transpose back to what we were looking at, but what if they do play a move such as knight d7 or e5 here? It does leave us a little bit of a tricky dilemma where I think the move that's going to be sort of most in keeping with our our repertoire is just going to be to play d5. And if they play bishop e7, we just go e4 and just kind of play these positions where the bishop's obviously not as good on e7 as on g7. And we can kind of understand, from looking at some of those other positions that, after e4, we're just kind of able to just go bishop e2 and, it's true they're not forced to castle like they might play a move such as a5 and try to delay this, but still the move of h4, this is still going to give white pretty good chances. We can still play, very familiar ideas to what we saw before. So you can see that a lot of these lines here are just kind of fairly transpositional. If you sort of have some, some sort of idea plan, you just can play in a very similar fashion to what we've seen previously, just like adapting the move order slightly. And with that, I think that really concludes the picture on d4 and knight f6. And so what I'll do for the rest of this video is I'm just going to show you it's going to be more brief because it's something I'm probably going to leave more for a separate video for like a deep dive into like what to do if they don't play d5 or knight f6. I do want to share just a few creative ideas real quickly to conclude. So against e6, I'm actually going to, in this video, suggest transposing into the French with e4, which might seem like a bit of a strange decision, like aren't we, a d4 player, not an e4 player with this repertoire? But the first point is that after c4, they do have some extra alternatives to these moves. Like, the main thing that I'm sort of want to avoid is like after f5, you're basically going to be move order out of the move I'm going to be recommending against the Dutch. And so I think it's just kind of nice just to avoid the Dutch in this delayed version with our repertoire. And the other reason I do also have a little bit of a shortcut against the French that I do also want to mention really quickly. And that is that after d5, I do think the move bishop d3 is quite an interesting shortcut. It still fits that creative kind of spirit, but where, we're also, kind of broadening our horizons, like rather than staying in the same d4 positions all the time, we're learning like a little bit of how to play e4. So this is kind of part where, if you are someone who also plays e4 a bit or has in the past, then these ideas are going to show can help you to kind of enrich your e4 repertoire as well and make it a bit more creative. But to give just a brief summary of this line, like the move d4 is what you'll usually face. Like it's going to be probably a better move than moves like knight f6 or c5 that we'll touch on real quick a bit later. But basically, you're going to end up getting a position like this one. Like most of the time, your opponents are going to play the move c5, if not now, then in the very near future. And most of them are going to play the move knight c6. I will say, I think from Black's point of view, that bishop e7 and castles is probably the direction I would play as Black if I wanted to reliably equalize, but that's how I might save more from a French defense video for Black in the future. By the way, if you would like me to cover the French for Black in a future video, do just let me know down in the comments down below. But this is really going to be sort of the key position of this bishop d3 Schlechter variation, as it's called, where we've kind of got that Catalan-style pressure down the long diagonal, and what you're going to see the most often is going to be the move of c takes d4, knight d4, and now the move of knight e5, because if they take knight d4, which is also seen quite a bit, you're just going to have a dream endgame where again that pressure against the pawn is just going to be very, very unpleasant. In fact, the engine already says that white just has like over +1 advantage in a position like this, which obviously we're very, very happy about. But okay, as it happens, if they do play knight e5, there's a really cool idea that I actually saw in the chess mood files a while back, which is that after a6, queen e2, so basically they need to play to move knight f3, otherwise you just have this really strong attack on the king. But they kind of point out this cool move of g takes f3, where previously I'd kind of focused more on moves like queen f3 and knight f3 in the past, but I do think you get some very interesting attacking options with long castling and having that g file open. And also kind of helps with the most common move of bishop b4 is actually a bit of a mistake, because if they do try to double our pawns, we now have like knight e6, and you've got tricks like that that are going to be winning for white if you want to explore it more deeply in your own time as such. And what they probably should do is play moves like knight d5 or e5, but those are moves that probably not as likely for your opponent to sort of find in a sense. So this long castling, it's something you can look up yourself and explore in your own time if you want to go a bit deeper. But it really is kind of a matter of taste which way you take back. I think GF3 is the more fun one, and it is the one that scores better in the database. That's kind of what I based it on. If they do play something like bishop b4, then again, like knight b5 is the move I would sort of explore as the way to fight for an advantage. as white here. And if they play a move such as bishop e7, well, then you can just go queen e2 and kind of use some of those ideas of like just going for the attack on the king, as it were, like g4, g5, this sort of thing. So in any case, also if they do play knight f3, you also have a cool trick in knight c6, where a position like this one is just going to just give you a very strong attack on the king. So there are ideas like that that also can trip black up very easily. But hopefully, yeah, that at least kind of gives you the picture of, even in the worst case scenario of what they play the most often, we still get a pretty good game. There are other moves like queen b6, e5, knight d5, like these are all a thing, even bishop to e7. But if they play queen b6, there are some fun lines where you can like sacrifice the pawn, but just get some really good play where you just have a bit too big of a lead in development. Again, I'll kind of let you explore some of these ideas in your own time if you want to go deeper, but the gist of it is that white is just completely winning in this position. The lead in development is just going to be way too big in a case like this when black doesn't develop the bishops or the rooks at this point. So with that, I'll move on to a couple of alternatives just real quick. Again, I understand there's a much less deep coverage of the bishop d3 move than some of the other lines, but that's also just because you won't face e6 as often. So that's kind of why we're going a little bit less in depth. Knight f6 is actually a very common mistake. You can see 20% of the time, even at 28% of the time, even at the 2000 plus level. And the reason it's a mistake is it's just very easy for white to just defend their center. Like black just doesn't really get the sort of active play they were hoping for because queen b6, bishop c2, the center is just perfectly safe. The knight kind of gets in the way of their bishop developing. And you have to takes. Like knight b4 is the move that normally is the problem in some other versions where the bishop can get out. But here you can just keep the bishop alive, and black just really struggles to make any sense of the position at all, whereas we can just attack with natural moves. And I mean, already it's a strategically winning position for white. So there's some plans you can kind of use to build up your initiative there and just leverage your extra space. And if they do play a move like c5, there is a really cool little trick I want to show you. One actually I even nearly fell for myself once, but one I also caught out one of my French defense playing friends with Israel like about 200-ish FIDE, because he played the move queen d5 against me, and I kind of caught him out with this knight c3 move, that if they take the pawn, then the queen gets trapped. That's kind of what I caught him with. And if you do play the move of queen d4 instead, which is the more common one, then yeah, you just go knight b5, and you just get a really strong initiative with bishop f4 and stuff. So yeah, it's just not going to be a playable position for black whatsoever. For that reason, black really should play ed5, and it is a move you will tend to see more often. But yeah, you've got a few different choices, like the move of c3 is one that probably feels the most healthy. There's other ones like knight f3 and dc5, and if you play the French defense as black, like say if you've watched my fairly recent video on how to win as black in the French exchange variation, you could play the move bishop b5 and transpose back into the that French defense line with c4, knight c6, bishop c5 sort of b4 sort of thing. But just this time we're doing it with colors reversed. So that's I think a pretty good system that also will reward those who have been watching these videos. I also will put a link as well if someone reminds me in the comments. But yeah, that would be my suggestion. Like just play bishop b5. Avoid moves like c4 that kind of allow black to potentially get a kind of solid equality in a position like this. Like obviously you can still play this way. Like again, it's very similar to the kind of positions we were looking at actually in that win with the exchange French video. So it's kind of interesting to see how actually in this position we're kind of, whichever way we played, it's going to really be applying those ideas I covered in that vid on the exchange French, where I went really, really deep. So that does make life a bit easier in terms of covering that. What if they play a move such as c5, which is kind of the next most common one? I mean, in this case, the lazy option would just be to play c4 and just transpose into the lines we were looking at before. I will say that I think it is worth it at some point to learn how to play lines with knight c3 and e4, because those do give you a bigger advantage out of the opening. And personally, I've been playing the move bishop c4 a lot and having some really good results with it. Like it has a 67% win rate in the. Well, sorry, I played h6, not g6. My bad. But yeah, this move of bishop c4 is like quite a rare one, but one I have been having really good results with. So that can be a direction you might want to explore if you do want to really punish them for playing the move c5 a bit too early. And stuff like a Benoni wall just doesn't really prove strategically sound. Like even just playing like knight e2 and knight d2 and just bring the knight towards c4. Like that's obviously going to give white just a very clear advantage with very natural moves. So this is just ultimately not going to be playable for black because of this little resource to bring the e knight to c3 rather than the more obvious b knight. And also if they do play something like... So it's interesting actually to see the 2000 plus level that g6 is a little bit more common than d6 here. So the moves I'm going to sort of cover are going to be g6, d6, f5, and I'll sort of conclude with e5 as kind of like the last move that I'll touch on. Because like if they go b6, you can kind of just play very common sense moves, and that's just going to give you an advantage without really needing to know any theory. You just play a kind of Geller setup here as white, like this or this, or e5 if you do want to try to punish them more. But either way, white's just going to be a lot better. So with that, we're going to focus more on some other moves like g6 instead. And there is actually a really cool setup you can play against the modern that kind of avoids a lot of these independent lines where they try to, avoid or delay the move knight f6 to transpose to the pirates. So I usually do play d6, because if c5 again, you can kind of... Well, you could also just play the move d5, and although it is true in this case, if you do play like c4, you are move ordering yourself a little bit out of our systems, but, then the bishop c4 move that I mentioned is going to kind of fit together quite well, and, white's plans are also just going to be pretty natural in a position like this, just prepare to e5 break. So that can be sort of a practical answer where you don't have to like learn like the refutations like dc5 and the French kind of theory there, which I might end up covering it like in a repertoire video in the future because those lines are quite interesting. But yeah, I just want to kind of take a little bit of a different approach for this one. And if they go c6, you can just play c4 and just kind of argue that in a position like this, they just don't really get what they're after. But obviously d6 is going to be the bigger question of what to play. And I know that in some past YouTube videos, I just recommend this approach of bishop c4, queen e2, and this kind of thing. But for this video, I did want to offer something a little bit different and a little bit more original that's also going to fit in quite well with our system against the pirates. And that is going to be the move of bishop to e3. And most of the time, your opponent's going to play knight f6 and it's going to transpose back into the pirate's defense anyway with some queen e2 and these kinds of ideas up our sleeve, as well as the h3 move if needed. But the thing is that if they don't play knight f6, they kind of end up in a bit hot water. Because if knight c6, you can kind of just go like knight c3, and they're probably going to play knight f6 anyway, because a position like this just doesn't really work for black. Like you just go castles, just normal attacking moves, and the black position is just not playable essentially. And if they do play some other moves like a6, the Tiger's modern that I also played quite a lot as black, by the way, in the past. But the thing is that c4 is just a really good move. We're just able to get an improved King's Indian, where a6 is just kind of useless, and white is just going to just be very comfortably better. And if they do play e5 at some point, it's just going to kind of lead us towards the sort of plans we saw earlier, where it's a little bit different with g4 compared to h4, but you're still often playing h4, h5, h6 there anyway. So it is going to lead to a similar kind of position where, again, the move a6 is just completely useless for black. So you're a tempo up on a line that is already very good for white to begin. And then we stop knight f4 with g3 as well, of course. Like this is a tactic that's like pretty obvious to most people, but you have experience these structures, but I'll just show it to you anyway, just so that we're all on the same page here. For those who don't play the Makoganov as white with h3 and a King's Indian. But yeah, you can kind of see like a6 doesn't really work that well. C6 again, you can even just play c4 and c6 just doesn't really gel that well in the King's Indian somehow. So with that, yeah, that just kind of avoids all of these different modern sort of a6, c6 lines or knight c6, and it just leaves black with kind of just a very bad position if they do try to insist on their setup. And with that, I think we can move on to some of the other lines, like the move of d6 that I do want to get to, and the reason I'm going to recommend playing e4 and transposing into some of those Pierce defense lines, like the one that I just showed you here from a modern move order, is that if you do play c4, they do have moves like e5, which is actually quite a respectable line for black. And while you do still have options, like you could still play d5 and try to play in a similar vein to some of the other positions. I do think this is one where, again, black is going to be fairly happy with this structure. They have some different ideas like playing bishop e7 and try and trade off our bishop later, or going like a5 and playing on the queen side. And I think white probably does have a very small advantage in these positions. I just think that it's kind of fighting more on black's territory. Whereas by playing e4, yeah, we're kind of able to put in a little bit of extra work to be comfortable in e4 positions as well, but it does allow us to get much more of an advantage and kind of punish them a little bit for their choice of move order. And yeah, after the move of g6, like I said, we're just going to play knight f3, bishop e3, and the plan is just going to be, if they castle, put the queen on d2 and just essentially go for the attack on the king like this. And it turns out that, yeah, normally you might be more familiar with this attack when you have the pawn on f3 rather than the knight on f3. But the knight being f3 is going to give us some extra flexibility that's going to come in really handy in the lines where black doesn't castle into our attack like this. If they play knight g4, I would just go bishop g5, and black's position doesn't really make a whole lot of sense here. Like, all they're doing is really just weakening their position, and you're making it very easy for us just to attack their king with a move like h4. So their attempts to chase our bishop just really backfire on quite severely, which also explains why we don't play the move h3. We just don't need it here. If they play c6, yeah, I would just go bishop h6, and I mean, you can even just play it very positionally. Just play a move like bishop d3 or even a3, just stopping the move of b4. And he's going to kind of make the point that in a position like this one, like you don't even need sort of long castling. You kind of just go directly for the attack because b4 is not possible yet because of the pin anyway. And so this is a way in which you can just really make black's life very difficult with some pretty natural attacking ideas. Like c6 is just a little bit too slow for black at the end of the day. And also knight c6, just d5, and these kind of structures again are just an absolute dream come true for white. Like, we're just going to use the space, use the development, throw the pawns at the king, and black is going to have a very, very hard time. Indian is already giving +1 for white here. So, and like at b5, yeah, there's just any move's going to be good for white, but even just rook g1 is just a really nice way to completely neutralize the queenside pawn storm. But just make sure this pawn's defended, and that it's not really getting anywhere. Our attack is just way faster, and we've got the space and other strategic advantages to back it up. Going back a little bit to this, I was thinking if there's any other moves I should really mention, but like knight d7, you can kind of just play the same sort of plans, and bishop g4 just doesn't really work. Like, you can go knight g5 and play h3, and you're just kind of getting a better version of some of these other positions that we'll see a bit later. And so the remaining question is, what if they don't castle? Like, what if they play a move such as c6 or a move like knight g4? Again, with knight g4, in this case, actually, bishop f4 might be a little bit more precise than bishop g5. But to be fair, you're kind of much better either way. Like, a position like this, I mean, you're basically just a tempo up, having got in the move of h3 effectively for free at this point. And also, if they do play something like e5, it just doesn't really work for black. Like bishop g5, I'm just not really understanding what the point of black's play is, where we just have pretty natural and powerful moves to just be much better. So with that, we can, I think, move to the move of c6, which I do feel like is probably the trickiest move for us to deal with, because they're not giving us an easy attack with castles, but they might play a move like b5 instead, for instance. But I will say, I think still bishop h6 is a pretty good move here. Like, the idea is that if they do take and try to win a pawn with b4, which is what nearly everyone does as black, we have a few quite nice options at our disposal. And the one that I really like is actually knight d1. This is the way the engine wants to play it, where you just sacrifice the pawn, and you just get a very nice initiative. Because if you look at black's king, like, how are they going to find safety, right? Like, they can't castle legally, our queen is in the way. They can't really castle long for a very long time, and even if they do, they've already moved all these pawns around the king. And if the king stays in the center, I mean, you're just going to, just open things up at the right time and basically just win the game. a3 also is a nice way just to open up the queen side and just sort of bring the rook into the attack. And I mean, I just don't really know what black should do. Like, black is just much worse, and white is winning like nearly all the games in the database. So it's just a very, very depressing position for black when they end up with something like this. And we just have all of the attack, all of the attacking ideas to just really finish off their king in the center. And so that, yeah, just kind of shows that actually this bishop e3 knight, this line, it's honestly one of the main reasons why I kind of stopped playing the Pirates as black, because I just couldn't find a system here that I liked. And the engine just kind of confirms that, like, everywhere white is just significantly better. Like, I don't even really know what should black should do. Like, to give you an idea, the top line of the engine is to play the move c5 and, sacrifice a pawn and say you have partial compensation. But I mean, even here, you're not really getting full compensation for the pawn. This is probably not something you're really going to face much, by the way. This is just kind of out of interest. But like even here, I still feel like white is just going to be better. Like you're up a pawn, you've got good development, you have no weaknesses. So I'm just not really sure, yeah, what I would do as a Pirates player, other than probably just drop the opening, to be honest. So yeah, knight f3, bishop e3, just very, very good for white, as we can see. They do have the option of playing in a kind of Philidor style. Just bear with me one sec. So in this position, they can play moves such as e5 or c6 or knight bd7. And against e5, I'm going to suggest a little bit of a creative shortcut that is actually the best scoring line for white in the database. At 2,000 plus rating, white is scoring 50% of the wins with, winning 50% games with 92. Considering white's only winning 43% versus black's 48 with knight f3, obviously this knight 2 is practically a lot more powerful. And then a really nice little idea I want to share is this move h3. And we're kind of playing an improved version of these sort of Fianchetto g3 approaches. Because often in the g3 lines, you're going to end up playing like h3, g4 and expanding in the middle game anyway. And so when you play h3, you're basically saying to black, well, I'm just going to play just a more aggressive version with an extra tempo because you just don't have a way to take advantage of it. So in a position like this, I just think white is just doing very, very well. And the thing is, you also just have very natural moves. Like you can go, castles, bishop e3, knight g3, a4 to after c6, and it's just very hard to know what black's plan really should be in a position like this. I mean, a computer saying you can even benefit from, delaying short casting and just kind of going for the attack. But I mean, if you do decide just to castle, I mean, it's not going to give you the maximum advantage, but you are still going to get a small advantage from something like this as well. So you do have a bit of choice in how you sort of play the rising position. You can go to the lazy approach, which gives you a small edge, or you can put in a bit more work with like some long casting lines that will give you a little bit of a bigger edge, but also with a little bit more risk attached to it, of course. So with that, yeah, we can kind of see that black really isn't really coming up with such a great reply. Like honestly, the move h5 might be maybe the best practical try for black. But the thing is, even if you just play a move such as g3, then like in this case, this h5 is just not really so great in the g3 lines anymore. And if you just play like a4, and most of the time they don't end up castling, funnily enough. But I'm not really sure what black is doing if they don't castle. Like you can just play like bishop e3 and moves like queen d2 just to keep that option of going g4 if they castle, or sometimes even if they don't castle. But yeah, at the end of the day, like a position like this is just, I think, ultimately just not playable for black. So with that, yeah, it gives you again a few ideas to work with. Like if they don't allow g4, you can just revert back to g3 and just say this move doesn't make sense from black's perspective. Now, if they do play it, whoops, give me a moment. Now, if they do play it a little differently, where move like bishop e7, then you can still play the move h3 anyway. And I mean, if they castle, yeah, you just get this g4, this very ready-made attack. Like if ed4, you can even play like queen takes d4, and even the tempo game on a queen doesn't really hurt us too much because we can just go like bishop g2 and kick away the knight later, and we just kind of put our pieces just on very natural and very strong squares. So it's not hard really to understand why white is better with such an extra space on the king side and also in the center of the board, of course. In any case, going back, if they do play a little differently, like if they play c6, odds are they're probably going to play knight d7 at some point anyway. You can also just play a4, like the engine's not the biggest fan of it. But yeah, it is the case that you can just play bishop g2, and if they do get in b4, it's not even the end of the world. They can still recycle the knights and still keep an advantage in a position like this. Like in main position, you'll have a3 to just kind of use that pawn as a bit of a weakness. Even you can do it immediately if you really want to. But I think castles is a bit safer. So, and in any instance, if they do play, let's think if there are any other moves they can kind of go for that might be a bit tricky. I mean, I guess they can play the move e takes d4. And actually, this idea I honestly didn't even know existed until I just saw it right now in the database. But it turns out that queen takes d4 is actually a very interesting alternative to the standard knight takes d4. And like I said, I didn't even know this was a thing, so it's definitely going to surprise your opponents. But the idea is that you're basically just going to play this. If they go bishop e7, you can kind of go bishop to like f4. Like there are other lines that are also better, but you're basically going for a position like this one essentially. Actually, castles long and b5 might be a little bit of an annoying thing on a practical level. Yeah, I'm just cleaning up the PGN just for reference later. But something like this I think could be a little bit awkward to deal with, even if the engine still says white's a bit better. Like black is getting some quite real counterplay here. And for that reason, I think it's easier probably just to play f3 first, just to take the sting out of b5. Because you're still going to be playing f3 anyway, right? And then you just have a very clear plan of like knight d4, pawn storm, and kind of like what I covered in some of the beginner chess opening videos recently for white, that like knight takes d4 in the Scotch. So you can kind of use ideas like that just to have a very good position as white in this case. That's a reason why probably knight c6 is going to be a better move for black by comparison. But then we do have a few interesting ideas, like the engine wants to play the move queen d1 just to keep the queen out of harm's way. And if they go bishop e7, you can kind of just go even a move like h3 is one the engine likes a lot. Where again you can't go g4 and transpose back to what we were looking at just a moment ago. So it's kind of quite a nice continuity between the two systems in that sense. And if bishop e6, you can also go knight f4 and just not let them get that freeing d5 break for equality. And obviously the bishop pair will not hurt us later on as well if we do end up grabbing it one way or the other. And if they do play g6, which is kind of the way the engine recommends playing it, again, you can just kind of play for very similar sorts of ideas like queen d2. And, if they play natural moves, I just think white has a very nice advantage, like long castles and going for some very familiar attacking plans. They probably need to find the move of b5 where they won't have any chances to maintain the balance. This one is a novelty, by the way, but I do think that even here I would still slightly prefer white's chances. Like you haven't castled long, so you're not worried about this pawn storm as much, and that gives you the option to still play it a bit more positionally, like something like knight e3, for instance, and just keep the control as white. Even something like this is just going to be very safe. In any case, that's kind of the worst case scenario, but not something you're really going to face too much. But yeah, I am personally really excited about this queen d4. It's like a completely fresh idea that I literally didn't know about until recording this video, and one that I'll definitely be excited to try it in my own games next time the chance comes up. So if they do play knight d7, we can kind of see that they're probably going to play e5 anyway. So just going to transpose to what we were just looking at. And also, if they do play like c6 here, in this case, like the move f4 is one I actually covered recently in a video of Don't Play This Against Tal. But people aren't probably going to play Smagan's move of queen b6. They're probably going to play queen a5 instead. In that case, like bishop d3, like I don't think you really need to know too much theory to prove that white is just significantly better. Like just play normal, healthy moves, and just kind of let black kind of stew in their own juice of their poor opening choice. So anyway, with that, I think that covers the picture of d4, d6, e4 pretty well. And that leaves us with two other moves. I'll cover the Dutch first and leave e5 to the end. So the system I'm going to recommend against the Dutch is actually going to be to play the Jabava London against the Dutch, and it's something that I actually did in fact cover in a course of mine earlier this year with some pretty cool ideas. But rather than just keeping it behind a paywall and people not really benefiting as much from it, I want to just share with you my ideas freely. So after e6, the idea that I sort of came up with as white was the move of g4. This is like a a gambit that I think just gives white very, very nice compensation. To the point where I would even say that white probably is a little bit better in these kind of positions. Actually, h3 is probably a more effective move than e4 in this version, just to open up the king side. Now, because this is rather than just like repeating just what I said in the previous video, I do want to offer something a little bit original as well. So we'll also mention that a move that is sort of quite interesting according to the computer is to just play a move like e3 and saying if bishop to b4. I think this move at 92 is kind of an interesting strategic approach. Like obviously it's not as fun as the move of g4, but it is one I think will also give white some pretty decent chance of an advantage. Like we're obviously very happy if they trade and solve the problem of our development. We can just castle long and then just sort of go for the attack on the center on the king side using f5 as a bit of a hook. So bishop e7 really is the move that black should play, but then we still have some interesting ideas of h3 and then if d6 g4 and just sacrificing the pawn just to get that big attack on the king, and usually black ends up taking it in practice. But then after a move like bishop to g3 and queen d3, I just think that white is just significantly better. You have a very, very strong attack, and I do think black is going to have a very hard time surviving in a position like this one. Like just to show you the engine line as an example. So that's going to be my suggestion. Like to play the move at e3 is something a little bit more creative, where if they do play bishop e7, you can kind of then go h3 and still go for that g4 attack, this time out without even needing to sacrifice a pawn. And yeah, well, I think the immediate g4 is probably objectively the strongest. This one can be a good alternative for those of you who don't want to like sacrifice a pawn for as long term a compensation, where like it's a bit more obvious where the compensation is in this case. And if they play g6, I just think h4 is just a really strong move, as I also mentioned in a course of mine previously. I mean, even if you just take your time with a move like e3, and if d6, just play like bishop c4 and make it hard for him to castle. Like it is pretty clear that this is just going to be a very strong attack for white. Like you have more than enough compensation for the exchange in a position like this, and your attacking move is just very, very natural with g4 to start. And if they do play like castles first to try to avoid that, then just h5 again, and this attack is just going to be even stronger with the exchange sack when they've already castled the king into the attack. So again, like just play natural attacking moves, and you're just going to win pretty much. And if they go queen e5, there's actually a little bit of a. I mean, I probably would just play queen h2 and just keep the queens on. Is probably the way I would play it. There was one tactic I was tempted to mention, but okay, if you see it, you'll know what I mean, what I'm referring to. But as it so happens, yeah, I just think that this is just a really nice system. It doesn't have a whole lot of theory attached to it, but I just think that with ideas like g4 at different moments, that white is going to have an advantage. If they do play the move of d5, I mean, d5 is a move you're only going to see like 11% of the time, but it's one that you're just going to use just sort of standard Jabava London ideas, just realizing that, the pawn at f5 is just a very weakening move in giving this square for the knight. And after c6, yeah, this is just an absolute dream position for white, like knight f3, or like none of your moves are even difficult. Like you're just playing very, very natural moves. You can also have some fun, like you go like h4, g4, that's going to be the way to get the biggest advantage. But like even if you develop naturally, you're still going to be much better here. So this is just ultimately not going to be a playable position for black at the end of the day, after say a3 and this kind of attack to follow. For this reason, probably the best option for black is actually to play the move of a6, which it's only been played in like 10% of the game, so you're really not going to see it all that much. But in that case, there's even moves like g4 that, again, is a nice way to get a sort of similar attack to what we saw in the earlier lines, where obviously a6 is not really looking so useful for black in this version anymore. So that's probably the way that I would kind of approach it, just this nice little g4 gambit. In fact, a move like queen to d3 first and sort of delaying h3 and keeping your options open might actually be even more effective. Just so that in some lines, if they play g3, you can kind of take back with the queen and keep that sort of battery in a sense. But certainly, if you get something like this, it's pretty clear that white has just got like a massive advantage with the lead in development, and the king just forever unsafe in the center as black. Anyway, going to the one final kind of system they can play, like if they do play the move of the England Gambit, I would just keep it very practical. Like just give back the pawn with, Queen e7, Knight c3, and I'll show you a cool final trick to conclude, which I've sort of been itching to share in a while actually, but this move in Knight d5 is one that actually has a 60% win rate in the Chess.com database at the 2000 plus level. And if they play Queen d8, this move of Queen d4 has actually been very problematic for black, because if they play d6, you can kind of just go for like e4 and just get this attack down the g file with your development and your space. And if they play a move such as c6, which is nearly as common in the database, this falls for a little trap. Like now we're trapping the England player for once, where we can just play queen at e5, play knight c7, and well, knight e7, knight c7, or bishop e7, queen g7, or knight c7 to win a rook. Also will do the trick. But yeah, I mean, you can see black is just completely dead lost in a position like this one, just being down a rook. So that's the final idea I wanted to mention to sort of conclude. And like if d6, like as long as you know bishop g5, you can usually figure out the rest from there in terms of how to win it as white. And yeah, there isn't really like any other major moves like d6, knight 6 is going to kind of transpose again. So with that really I think concludes the picture on this creative d4 repertoire. And once again, the video ended up being a little bit longer than I had initially planned, but I think it was really nice to kind of go deep and to really see how when you really focus on shortcuts the way that masters and grandmasters do today, not only do you have a lot more fun with it, but it also just allows you to master the positions a lot more quickly and set fresh problems to the opponent that they are unlikely to have looked at beforehand. Like my guess is that most of the time, like if when they're facing, for example, a move like h4, that probably most of the time your opponent is going to start thinking like either now or on the next move or two, just not knowing what on earth to do against this. I also realized that I did kind of forget to mention the alternative approach I was going to show, and this one's called the anti-Nimzo Indian, in case you're wondering. But it's where you play to move a bishop to f4, and if d5, you basically can then take, and you end up kind of transposing into the Sarana like exchange QG after a later bishop knight c3. There are also some fresh approaches where you can also delay the move of knight c3 and play like this, but you are probably going to play knight c3 in the very near future anyway. So it's like more just like kind of a way more just to kind of surprise the opponent and move on them a little bit more than anything else. But just mentioning it, yeah, for those who do want like an alternative system that they can also play when they just want to avoid the Nimzo altogether. And it's something that I might end up covering actually in a future video because I think it's a very interesting topic. But essentially, like knight d5 is kind of the going to be the most principled move and the one you kind of should have some sort of idea against as white to sort of complete the repertoire. And also it does mean that even though you avoid the Nimzo with this knight d2 move, there are also some other moves like c5 and b6 that also can lead some different types of positions, like more of a Nimzo Indian, or a Queen's Indian type of play. But yeah, if you're interested in me covering Bishop F4 in a detailed video, just let me know and I will be happy to do that because I do think it is a very interesting topic. It just be about finding the right how to say like find the right title to get people interested in it. I mean, Carlson's anti-London system could be a fun one. Maybe I'll go with that. But yeah, or anti-Nimzo system rather. But it's kind of like a London. It's like a London combined with Queen's Gambit. So yeah, if you want, you can try that out as a possible alternative to Knight C3. But yeah, with that, that's all I have for this one. Also, just something real quick that if you did watch this all the way to the end, then congratulations. I do have something cool to share with you. So basically, these days I'm focusing more actually on something called high performance coaching. If you're familiar with self improvement and personal growth, it's definitely very much in that sort of vein, where we're not just going to be working on like improving your sort of raw skill in something, as we would see with private chess coaching, for example. It's really about just helping you improve your life in general, to improve all the different areas like your career, your health, your wealth, relationships, and all the other different aspects of one's life. And yeah, if that's something that interests you, just send an email to illingworthchess@gmail.com. So that's illingworthchess@gmail.com. And yeah, we can talk about seeing if this next level coaching is the right fit for you. Because I mean, it's not going to be right for everyone. Like I do have a application process and like very selective in who I work with, which is also why I've only mentioned this at the very end of the video to make sure it's only ones who are really kind of serious learners that are going to notice this as it were. But if you are one of the few, then congratulations, and I will see you all in the next video.